Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. President-elect Donald Trump has threatened to reclaim control of the Panama Canal if the country refuses to lower its fees for the shipping routes. And in Germany, questions mount over the deadly Christmas market attack as local authorities face criticism for not taking warnings from Saudi Arabia into account. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to act with force against Yemen's Houthi militia. To our top story, US President-elect Donald Trump is threatening to retake control of the Panama Canal, accusing the country of charging excessive rates for using the Central American Passage. The Panama Canal sees up to 14,000 ships passing through each year. More importantly, is vital for US imports from Asia and exports of commodities, including liquefied natural gas. Speaking to a crowd of supporters in Arizona, Trump suggested that he could demand the canal be returned to the US, quote, quickly and without question.
We're being ripped off at the Panama Canal like we're being ripped off everywhere else. A secure, he just said take it back. That's a good idea. It was not given for the benefit of others by a token of cooperation, but it was given to Panama and to the people of Panama, but it has provisions. You got to treat us fairly, and they haven't treated us fairly. If the principles, both moral and legal, of this magnanimous gesture of giving are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question. I'm not going to stand for it.
Our correspondent Mitch McCann with the background and the history.
Less than a month before he takes office, Donald Trump has a new target, Panama, accusing the country of overcharging America for the use of the Panama Canal.
Because we're being ripped off at the Panama Canal like we're being ripped off everywhere else. A secure, he just said take it back. That's a good idea.
The US built the canal in the early 1900s as a means of transporting military and commercial vessels, but handed over control to Panama at the turn of the last century under a treaty signed in 1977 by then-President Jimmy Carter.
When they gave it to Panama, can you believe that? We would never have done it if we thought what's happening now can happen, and we would never, and we will never, ever let it fall into the wrong hands, but it's falling into the wrong hands.
Between 13,000 and 14,000 ships use the canal every year, mostly from the United States, China, Chile and Japan. Reports say because of droughts severely impacting the water supply to the canal, the number of available slots has decreased and the fees to pass through have increased in recent years. Donald Trump says that's not good enough and is threatening to take back ownership.
You got to treat us fairly, and they haven't treated us fairly. If the principles, both moral and legal, of this magnanimous gesture of giving are not followed, then we will demand that the Panama Canal be returned to the United States of America in full, quickly, and without question. I'm not going to stand for it.
In a video statement released shortly after Mr. Trump's Sunday speech, Panama's president hit back, denouncing his comments. He said, "I want to express that every square metre of the Panama Canal and its adjacent areas belong to Panama and will continue to belong to Panama. The sovereignty and independence of our country are not negotiable," he said. Jose Raul Molino said fees to use the canal are not, quote, set on a whim, and that they consider market conditions, international competition, operating costs and the needs of maintenance. The feud is likely to continue, with Donald Trump then posting an AI-generated image of a US flag in a canal, accompanied by the caption, "Welcome to the United States Canal." Mitch McCann, Al Arabiya News, New York.
For more analysis on Trump's Panama Canal threat, we're joined by the former US Deputy Secretary of Defense, Jim Townsend. Jim, thanks so much for joining us this evening. First of all, a huge diplomatic row brewing, and Trump has not assumed office yet. What do you make of his threats regarding the Panama Canal?
Well, you're right in the sense that he's not even the president yet. We have a president, it's Joe Biden, and this is not something that the U.S. administration has been worried about. This is something that now Trump is taking on, and it's really he's posturing and he's bullying, quite frankly, in a very undiplomatic way. But we got to get used to that. But he's bullying the Panamanians about these transit fees. But as your report points out, it's not just us, it's the Japanese, it's the Chileans, Chinese, others pay this transit fee. And we should all come together and go negotiate something with the Panamanians if there's an issue here. But we shouldn't take out a baseball bat and begin to bully them. That's not the way to start negotiations.
Why do you think Trump has said this? Is it really because of excessive fees or countering Chinese influence?
Well, I can't tell you. I don't know. I don't know what is going through his mind. I don't know if it's just the excessive fees. Trump seems to repeat a lot of things that the last person who he spoke to before going on a rally, he will remember what that last person said to him, and he'll repeat it without any investigation or any truth checking of the situation. So it could very well be that he just heard that there were high fees and that we were being ripped off, and he just repeated that. It might not be based on anything at all. In terms of Chinese influence and that type of thing, well, the Chinese are a tremendous trading partner with the United States. They probably do use the Panama Canal. But I think we have to look at how much is everyone paying for these fees, or is the U.S. being singled out or not? That's what matters. But let's handle this in a negotiation, not with rhetoric and harsh words back and forth.
The reality is Trump is coming into office, and that's something that is 100% happening. But what kind of message is this sending? Is it going to be raising concerns?
Well, I think it's going to be confirming concerns, if anything, because we saw a lot of this in Trump's first term. He's coming now back even more bold and with a lot of rhetoric that he doesn't seem to mind throwing out there, no matter of the impact. So I think what we're seeing is what we need to expect after January 20th, when he's inaugurated, that any efforts he might have thought he was going to make to try to be less, bullying and less rhetorically driven, any chance of him being a little calmer this time around, I think we just saw over the past 24 hours, that won't be the case. We just have to get used to this and know that that's the way he starts things. But then if there's a real problem here, the professionals have to go in there and negotiate a solution to the problem. The rhetoric doesn't do that.
So far, Trump has referred to Canada as a 51st state. He has also set his sights on Greenland. And now, as we've just been talking, threatened Panama in many respects. Do you think that this is an indication of how Trump will treat crucial allies during his second term in power?
Well, I think it is. We'll have to see. It could be that before the inauguration, if he's talking to a rally, he gets into that campaign mode and he says these things. Will he be that way after January 20th? Probably in some ways. And it's something that I don't think he reserves just for countries that are not allies. I think if you're an ally and you have rubbed him the wrong way, he's going to be this harsh on the air. But what does he do when he's not being filmed and there's not a microphone in front of him? What does he do behind closed doors? What do his people do? We have a Secretary of State and a Secretary of Defense and other cabinet officials who will be out there working with these countries. And I hope they're not going to be like that. I think this is just something that comes from the president. But when things are negotiated, when solutions are trying to be found for problems, if we're trying to get allies to come along with us in a certain direction, you can't do that the way Trump does with that microphone. It has to be people in there who know how to work with others. And let's hope that we'll see more of that and less of the rhetoric.
Jim, do you think the team he's chosen to have around him can be the people to do those negotiations?
Some of them. We're going to have to see, because we don't know a lot of them in terms of how they might perform. Marco Rubio, I think, has a better record of being more of a diplomat, or certainly a politician, that he can get along with people. He's been reelected a number of times, so obviously he's got a constituency that likes what he says, and so I think we've Hegseth, who's supposedly who is online to be the Secretary of Defense. We don't know a whole lot about how he will act. We know him from television, this type of thing. We know the people around him can be professional, certainly the civil servants and certainly the diplomats and the military officers. But the other political appointees who are underneath Hegseth in the Pentagon, some of those are known, like Elbridge Colby is known, and he's good. Others we don't know. They've never been in government before, and we'll just have to see how they do. But when it comes to the kind of rhetoric that Trump pumps out, he's really the only one that speaks like that. The others that have been hired on by him for jobs in the administration, I don't think they reach quite his level of rhetorical responses. So let's see how they do once they get into office.
Jim, thank you so much. That was the former U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Jim Townsend, joining us there. Now, grief and anger in the German city of Magdeburg after a man ploughed his car into a crowd of shoppers at a Christmas market, killing 5 people and leaving at least 200 injured. German authorities are due to answer questions about the attack at a parliamentary committee next week. Authorities have identified the suspect as a 50-year-old Saudi psychiatrist named Taleb Abdul Mohsen, who arrived in Germany in 2006 and received permanent residency. The man identifies himself as a former Muslim and expressed support for the far right. 5 years ago, his work was even highlighted in a BBC interview.
My name is Taleb. I'm from Saudi Arabia. I'm an activist. I created a website to help people seeking asylum, especially from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. If I have time, I spend, totally helping Saudi asylum seekers between 10 to 16 hours a day. 90% of people who approach me are women between 18 and 30 years old.
Controversy is brewing over missed warning signs. German media reports reveal that authorities conducted a threat assessment of the suspect a year ago and shockingly found no specific danger. However, there were indications from outside Germany, citing anonymous sources. The German press agency, the DPA, reported that Saudi authorities had warned their German counterparts about the attacker and requested his extradition. These indications seem to have been ignored. Like the Saudi officials, the kingdom's citizens repeatedly warned German authorities about threats made by the Magdeburg suspect on social media. A 24-year-old Saudi female shared some of the alarming posts made by Taleb Abdul Mohsen, including one where he expressed his desire to kill 20 Germans. She stated that she felt it was her duty as a human to report him. Despite her efforts, they were met with indifference. Elsewhere, German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser has said that investigators are reviewing how authorities responded to earlier warnings about the Magdeburg suspect. It comes as the head of the far-left BSW party demanded Faeser explain why so many tips and warnings were ignored beforehand. And I'm pleased to say Al Arabiya Network has spoken to the Saudi woman who warned the German authorities 1 year before he committed the attack. For more on this, I'm joined here in the studio by Al Arabiya journalist David Campman. David, thank you so much for joining us this evening. First of all, just can you give us an idea about the Saudi lady who initially flagged the suspect?
Yeah, so Talib Abdel Mohsen basically had posted something on X. He had repeatedly beforehand accused German authorities of not fighting religious extremism in the proper way, and basically announced that he would have to do something big. So he asked the rhetorical question, will anyone blame me if I, quote, killed 20 random Germans? So said Saudi lady thought that that was definitely something that deserved attention. So she referred his case to the website of the Office for Migration and Refugees, who have an account on X, and they turned it down. They said, well, we are not in charge. This is a law enforcement matter, so you can refer it to the Berlin police. She got in contact with them, according to her statement, and they apparently reacted coldly, if I may quote her, and said, we are not in charge either. You will have to refer to the police in the state of Saxony-Anhalt, where he was residing. So she basically reported the whole thing to the Berlin police once again through a link on X, and that she was given on their official website, if I'm not mistaken, and apparently so to no avail.
But what were her main statements to her in her interview with our colleague, at Al Arabiya News?
Well, her main statements were that she saw the whole thing and said, oh my God, this is a call for murder. This is an announcement of a crime. I worry about those who might be killed, because at the time no one had been killed yet. And so I have to do something. This is why I have to report this, and the authorities have to do something. And in retrospect, she's saying they didn't do enough. They didn't do what was necessary. They should have heard me, and this was not something he said in secret. This was an open statement.
So she was raising concerns there. What have people who have had contact with Talib al-Mohsen in Germany been saying following this attack on the Christmas market, David?
There have been plenty of interviews, or not interviews, plenty of people spoke to the press who had personally had contact with him, professionally mostly, and there are a number of statements, but they all come down to a couple of things. Most people described him as difficult, to say the least, and lots of people said that he was at some point making random accusations against them, truly random, with no grounds, none at all, and accusations that were actually legal accusations. And most of them said we didn't want to have anything more to do with him at this point. Saudi citizens in Germany said, who had been in touch with him, he does not represent us. We want nothing to do with him.
So German security forces faced a series of difficult questions at Saturday's press conference in Magdeburg as senior police officers and city officials faced the press. Some reporters grew impatient with the lack of clear answers to their questions. I just want to know, how has this been reflected in German media, David?
Well, I would say when I take a look at the media, the leading media, I would say they mostly call for moderation at this point, not to be too, I'm not sure how to find the right word, not to be too hysterical at this point, to not let this divide us. Yet, however, there is a large question mark that has been there over and over again about how security handled this case, and lots of calls from news media accusing security institutions of not handling it properly, and calling for improvements, at least, and of shedding light for shedding light onto these latest events.
What about the political feedback from the main parties?
Well, I would say most of them have called for moderation too. However, there are also accusations against security institutions. There are some accusations within the currently still theoretically existing traffic light coalition against each other, who was not handling it properly. And generally, you could say there have also been calls for an improvement of security institutions, cooperation, or at least of shedding light, to shed light onto the latest events of how this could possibly happen.
David Kampman, thank you so much for joining me in the studio this evening with those insights. Our Al Arabiya journalist, David Kampman, thank you. Now over to Germany, where the country is still reeling from the terror attack. I'm pleased to say the Alternative for Deutschland MEP Thomas Fröhlich joins me now from Brussels. Thomas, firstly, I just want to say condolences to you and the people in Germany following this attack. I wonder what your initial thoughts once you heard the news of the attack were.
First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Believe it or not, but as an opposition party, we are rarely invited to German television, so this makes it even more ridiculous when our government tries to teach democracy to other countries. My first thoughts, I think you have to think about what leads to a terrorist attack like this. In my eyes, an attack like this is always also the result of one's own weakness. And this weakness is, in my eyes, typical of Western societies in general, and particularly it's typical also of German society. This is, in my opinion, also due to our history, which is repeatedly exploited for moral blackmail, especially by the political left. And this policy and the mentality behind this policy often lead to self-hatred, but also to a naive migration policy and to a naive policy of open borders. I think that left liberalism, which is the dominant ideology of our times in the West, has weakened our society, and it has reached the point where we are unable to prevent and to combat the negative consequences of the migration policy. And terrorist attacks like in Magdeburg are emblematic of this. And the hope now is that people will at least learn from the damage that has been caused.
Do you think this attack was preventable, and who ultimately bears responsibility for this from what we now know?
I'm sure that it was possible to prevent the terrorist attack. You have to keep in mind the chronology of Taleb al-Abdul Mohsen after coming to Germany. In 2006, Taleb al-Abdul Mohsen, I hope my pronunciation of the name is right, you know it better than me, but in 2006, he fled to Germany from Saudi Arabia after committing serious crimes in Saudi Arabia. In 2013, he was convicted in Germany for disturbing the public peace by threatening criminal acts. At the very latest, he should have been deported at this time. But nevertheless, in 2016, he applied for asylum and asylum was granted. So the authorities in Saudi Arabia repeatedly warned the German authorities about him. Multiple requests for his extradition were ignored by the German authorities. And I think this is a scandal. In the meantime, he was interviewed by Western media, for example, by the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or by the BBC, and he was presented as a model migrant. But over the years, he made politically very vague statements. He described himself as a leftist. I think 8 days before the terrorist attack, he gave an interview to an American media, and he described himself as a leftist. In the past, he worked as a refugee helper and shared also some pro-LGBT friendly views on his social media. But in the meantime, he also cryptically announced an attack, but this was ignored by the German authorities. Why was it ignored? Because the German authorities are too focused on fighting government critics and patriots in Germany. This is one of the biggest problems. So there is a wrong focus by the German authorities, and they ignored all the warnings. And I think this is a big problem, a huge problem, and I think that this terrorist attack could be prevented.
Do you think this terror attack will change the political landscape in Germany? There are upcoming elections. What is your feeling at the moment, and what is the feeling on the ground in Germany?
I think this will change a lot, because now it's a very interesting situation we have in Germany right now, because the media are now attempting to label the terrorist Taleb al-Abdul Mohsen as far-right extremist, and they try to shift blame for the attack onto the AFD, so onto my party of the political right, because he also tweeted 2 or 3 more right-wing content on his social media. But what is also ignored is that, or what is completely ignored, is that he also shared anti-German content, and he accused, for example, Germany of not accepting more migrants from Saudi Arabia. So people know that, in fact, he never should have been in Germany, and that he should have been extradited, expelled to Saudi Arabia. So I think that people will not believe in the narratives that are spread by the Western mass media right now. And I think that this will lead to a swift regarding the migration policy, because it's not the first attack. Remember, I think in June, there was also a terrorist attack in Mannheim. And the result was that the AFD, the Conservative Patriotic Party, which is critical towards migration, that our party get more and more votes, that our party increased in the polls. So, and I think this will be the same effect here after the terrorist attack in Mannheim.
Thomas Fröhlich, thank you so much for joining me from Brussels. The Alternative for Deutschland MEP there, Thomas Fröhlich. I'm now joined from Berlin by a member of Germany's Christian Democratic Union Party, an expert in international security, Mustafa Al-Ammar. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Firstly, was the reason for the German authorities not dealing with the Saudi woman's tip-off, and especially the official Saudi warning, was this political, in your opinion, or was it a security one?
Well, good evening. Thank you for having me. Well, it's a very strategic now. What we are facing is a big threat that we are facing, especially in our security and our society. It's both, as you mentioned, that is not only the political, but is a political and also security policy. Because first of all, politically, they didn't take it regarding the diplomatic ideology, and also about the security section or the security policy, because of the lack of the information that been dealing or exchange between the federal and also the domestic departments. So this is the both things. I think is not only from one side, and as you see, that's it. We haven't learned actually from what happened earlier this year, and also since 8 years since what happened also at the semi-tragic act in the Christmas market in Berlin. And I think now we need to deal more seriously with the warning from abroad, with our ally from different countries, because otherwise we are not taking responsibility, and also not being credible by another partners worldwide.
Lawmakers are to question intelligence agencies. Are politicians about to discover their intellectual approach to the issue of immigration, especially when it comes to asylum?
Well, we cannot just ignore one side and focus on another side. It's a big challenge for all of us in Germany. It's also for Europe. We cannot, that we're hiding ourselves and we're not taking responsibility from the world, and we are not taking care of the people who's coming to us, because our constitution putting the dignity and the human right on the top of our priority. But we need much practically, and we need much flexibility on the resolution, and also how taking responsibility with the security. This is a different types what we are talking here, because security, it's needing really to deal with every warning, and need to be also to focusing on the solution, not ignoring the security and just focusing on the immigration to find this as a big problem for us.
In an invitation to a rally, the AfD claimed that the recent attack highlights the dangers of Germany's immigration policy. And obviously, I was just speaking earlier about that issue. How true could this actually be?
Well, the other party, which they are also against us, against me and my colleagues, as we are with the immigration background, and they want to do the re-immigration. That means when they come to the charter or when ruling the country, they want also to depart us or to send us to one of Enzil and to keep us there or to jail us. So this is not a human right what they are wanting. Instead of just focusing on the immigration policy, they need also to focusing also of the security policy. We need to improve our security system. We need to give more authority for our judge. We need to give more for authority also for the security forces. We need the development. We haven't that much development at all. We haven't that stronger exchange with different countries.
So development when it comes to security, but how much will what has happened in Germany really affect the political landscape ahead? We know there's upcoming elections. Olaf Scholz's coalition has been under threat in many ways.
Well, Olaf Scholz, he haven't been, how to say that much. He loses the chance, let me say. Let me talk also to you frankly that he's not the person that he really to lead Germany or to make Germany in the front. Unfortunately, with Olaf Scholz, we lost a lot of credibility in the world. Also, he's not the face of the leadership in the country, and that's why it's caused a lot of problem in the countries. And also, there is a shortage with the budget. We have Olaf Scholz his promises was very, very hot in the beginning, but he haven't seen or he haven't fixed any problem in the country. And instead of fixing the problems, he's himself or his party is the problem for the leadership. And more than that, I think Thomas Hobbes said in the back in the history, he said, hell is the truth. Haven't seen yet. So I think now I hope they can see now the hell, they can see the truth and how to think or how to provide a new security model or how to make a new security system in our country. But this will take a lot of time because this is not an easy task to take, but it's need also to focus on our security and also how to give the responsibility for our system to increase and to increase the problems in the countries. But I don't think that Olaf Scholz will lead the country again. Our party with the Friedrich Merz, I think we are in the front and we are going to take the responsibility because we know what the human need. We know the nation, how to protect the nation, and we know how to be in the same level and the standard security with the other countries in the world.
Democratic Union Party and expert in international security, Mustafa Almar, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu vowed to retaliate against Yemen's Houthi militia after it fired a missile at Tel Aviv, warning that Israel would target what he described as the last remaining arm of Iran's axis of evil. The Houthis struck Israel's commercial hub yesterday with what they claimed was a ballistic missile, injuring 16 people and forcing many to leave their homes following the pre-dawn attack.
Just as we acted forcefully against the terrorist arms of Iran's axis of evil, so we will act against the Houthis. Only in this case, we are not acting alone. The US and other countries see the Houthis as a threat not only to international shipping, but also to the international order. Therefore, we will act forcefully with determination and sophistication. I tell you, even if it takes time, the results will be the same, just as against the other terrorist arms.
I'm joined from Tel Aviv by our correspondent Trent Murray. Trent, thanks so much for joining me this evening. First of all, the Israeli Prime Minister with some tough words against Yemen's Houthi militants today. Can you share a bit of what he said exactly?
Well, probably no surprise. We've become quite accustomed to these types of speeches from Benjamin Netanyahu. Very strong language suggesting that Israel is preparing for further attacks in Yemen. Now, of course, that comes after those 2 ballistic missile attacks that we saw last week in as many days, both hitting just before 3 a.m., which is why it's thought there have been no deaths or serious injuries. The missiles hit a primary school as well as a playground, but given the time of day, there was only light injuries reported. But certainly the suggestion now in the rhetoric from the Israelis is that they are now focusing on those Yemen-based Houthis after spending 14 months at war with Hamas in Gaza and, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon. They now seem to be targeting their focus on Yemen. We've seen some initial airstrikes already from them in response to that missile, but the suggestion that we just heard there from Prime Minister Netanyahu is that more is coming.
Have the Houthis reacted at all recently to these airstrikes, and is there any indication they are capable, their capabilities have been damaged, Trent?
Well, I mean, they certainly claimed responsibility for the firing of those two ballistic missiles. They say they were targeting military strikes, and then just today, the IDF says it intercepted 2 drones which had been fired, towards Israel from Yemen. Now, the Houthis have just put out a statement, actually, I was just reading it in the past hour again, claiming responsibility. So it would appear, despite the strong language and the threats coming from the Israeli government, they are showing no signs of backing off. They say they're doing this in solidarity with the people of Gaza, given that they've been under siege now for 14 months. But we should also be clear, the IDF has been hitting Yemen pretty hard. They hit Sana'a for the first time, the Yemeni capital. They also hit the port city of Hodeidah. It is thought that they targeted effectively the main ports that the Houthis were using crucially to make money, exporting and importing goods. So it's of course not just the Israelis doing this. We know the British and the US are also joined in that coalition to try and protect international shipping in the Red Sea. But despite these 3 major military heavyweights now attacking the Houthis, there is no suggestion from them that they're going to stop this action anytime soon. In fact, their rhetoric suggests that they're going to continue it even further.
Trent Murray, our correspondent in Tel Aviv, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the headlines today. The far-right AfD has held a rally in Magdeburg today following the Christmas market terror attack which left 5 people dead on Friday. German lawmakers are set to question the country's foreign and domestic intelligence agencies next week as questions remain over the failure to act on past warnings over the perpetrator. Oxfam has accused Israel of relentlessly using starvation as a weapon of war in Gaza. The organisation says only 12 trucks of food and water have been allowed to enter the besieged Palestinian territory in the past 2.5 months. Israel has rejected the report, saying it was deliberately ignoring their humanitarian efforts. Now, Iran has been hit by what experts are calling a dire energy crisis that has forced businesses and government institutions, including schools, to halt operations. Reports suggest the reasons could be due to a lack of investment in critical infrastructure, sanctions on the economy, and the recent Israeli airstrikes across the country. North Korea may be preparing to send more troops and weapons, including suicide drones, to Russia to support Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine, according to South Korean military. Seoul says Pyongyang has already supplied multiple rocket launchers and weapons to Russia, as well as 12,000 soldiers. Meanwhile, reports suggest around 1,100 North Korean troops have been killed or wounded in the Kursk region. Ministers from Jordan and Qatar have held meetings with Syria's new leader Ahmed al-Sharaa in Damascus today. Jordan's foreign minister said the country stands ready to help Syria rebuild following years of isolation under President Bashar al-Assad. They are among the first high-ranking Arab diplomats to visit the country. Now, a reminder of our top stories today. President-elect Donald Trump has threatened to reclaim control of the Panama Canal if the country refuses to lower its fees for the shipping route. And in Germany, questions mount over the deadly Christmas market attack as local authorities face criticism for not taking warnings from Saudi Arabia into account. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to act with force against Yemen's Houthi militia. And that's all from us on W News. Thanks so much for joining us. Coming up next is Riz Khan. And don't miss Tom Burges Watson with GNT. We'll see you all again tomorrow. Good night and thank you.
Hello, I'm Riz Khan. Welcome to the show. From Australia to the US, 300 million people around the world live in jurisdictions that allow residents a choice to end their lives prematurely in order to escape the pain and indignity of a protracted death. The UK Parliament recently became the latest legislature to take a step towards legalising assisted dying in England and Wales. MPs were freed from party loyalties for an emotional, respectful debate that contrasted with the political combat that often punctuates the House of Commons. At its conclusion, a majority voted in favour of a bill that would permit some adults to use drugs prescribed to end their lives. But there were conditions. They would have to be diagnosed as terminally ill with no more than 6 months to live, mentally capable of making the decision, and free from coercion to do so. Well, the bill must pass several more rounds of intense scrutiny from parliamentarians before it can become law. But the issue sparked a passionate national debate, with voices from different perspectives raising matters of ethics, faith and justice. At the same time, philosophers were preparing to cross continents for a conference in the Saudi capital, Riyadh, to discuss quality of life. In this episode, we'll consider attitudes to life and death from an ethical, practical and philosophical point of view. Dame Esther Rantzen is a celebrated British journalist and activist whose TV show, That's Life, ran for over 20 years, reaching audiences of more than 20 million viewers. Her campaigns have helped save children from abuse and the elderly from neglect. But now in her 80s, she's become a prominent figure in the campaign for assisted dying after revealing she's received a terminal cancer diagnosis. Her daughter and fellow campaigner, Rebecca Wilcox, joins me now. Rebecca Wilcox, it's really good to have some time with you, and it's sad that we're talking under these circumstances, but it's a very important subject. So for people like myself, we grew up seeing your mother, and half the country pretty much tuned into her every week on TV. And she was known as quite a staunch campaigner. Now, she bettered a lot of lives through those campaigns, and it seems she's taken on this one last campaign. I think you described it as her last campaign at your peril, something like that.
Yes, I said she doesn't want this to be known as her final campaign because there's still life in the old bird yet, is what she would say. And I would possibly get smacked over the head for saying that. Obviously, she doesn't agree with violence.
Now, the world got to know about Dame Esther's cancer when she revealed it on an interview that she had terminal cancer. And she also revealed that she was going to Dignitas, or signing up with Dignitas, the service in Switzerland that assists dying. Now, as your family would have already been aware, it seemed that her considerations were not so much for herself, but more about the impact it would have on the people around her, the people that she loved, perhaps facing prosecution for being involved in any way, as is the case with the law. So how did you and your family respond to your mother's decision?
It was an interesting one because whilst I've always been aware of her feelings towards end-of-life care and choice at the end of your life, I had no idea that she had signed up to Dignitas until she revealed it on a podcast. And I think a journalist rang me and asked me for a comment, which is pretty standard for growing up with my parents being in the public eye as they were. And so it wasn't a massive surprise, but it was, and it's in keeping with everything I know about her, but it was weirdly shocking because I felt that she wasn't near the end of her life. I felt that the treatment was going well. I love living in denial. It's not healthy. It's not good for you. I would never recommend it, but it helps me get through the day just to pretend that everything is okay. And the fact that she had gone about this with meticulous care and sorted out a future for herself that wouldn't hurt us showed how seriously she was taking this illness. I like to think of her as immortal and indomitable, and I think that was a bit of a shocking moment for me. I felt the rug pulled out.
There was also a massive reaction in the British media. There was a huge reaction with the public. Was Dame Esther surprised? Was she energized, or perhaps concerned at being part of this debate?
I think she accidentally fell into this debate and then realized it was meant to be. She sort of has an ability for touching on the zeitgeist. So I would say that happened when she did Child Watch, and out of that came Childline, the helpline for children. And when she wrote an article about loneliness, she received so many letters in response to that she set up Silverline, which was a helpline for older people who were feeling similar feelings. And then she talked about this, and it was absolutely the right time for the country to start considering it again. It had been 2015 when it was last debated in Parliament. It had sort of plateaued. And I think she lit a fire under it. And once she realized that this decision that she made for herself could help other people, that's always been her goal. She's never done anything for herself at the detriment for other people. She suddenly realized this was a subject that needed talking about. It needed airing. We need to talk about end-of-life care. Even if you disagree with the assisted dying bill, we need to talk about what happens at the end of your life, because sadly, we are all going to die. So your family need to know what you want, what care you want, what choices you want to make. And that's what this bill is about. It's about giving you further choices in that matter.
Rebecca, your mother's not known for doing anything half-heartedly. And apparently she contacted every member of Parliament in the UK government before the debate. Is that the case?
Oh, yes, absolutely. She knew that she wasn't physically able to go to the debate. She sent me in her stead, and I sat at the top and sat on my hands and tried not to shout at people when I assumed that they were saying something that I disagreed with or she disagreed with me. And because she couldn't be there, she sent this heartfelt letter filled with comment and fact that she really hoped they would sit and listen to, because that's what she wanted. She wanted everybody in the room to listen to the other side, regardless of the point of view that you come into the room with. Listen to the other side and then make a choice. We know that the public are majority in favour of changing the rules around assisted dying. We just wanted that reflected in the room.
Now, Rebecca, your father, Desmond Wilcox, is also a renowned journalist and filmmaker. And I gather both he and your mother had touched on this subject in documentaries in the past. Tell us about that.
They were trailblazers. They would go where subjects hadn't gone before. They didn't mind talking about the things that were difficult. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they covered this subject. Most recently, Mum made a series called How to Have a Good Death. And it was a really interesting eye-opener for her. And I think paved the way for this campaign, because she saw people suffer in a way that was not palatable, for want of a better word, and could not be helped by palliative care. She saw people's shunts fall out, and she saw people's morphine drop off, and she saw people's pain surpass the opioid barrier. And I think that created a deep-seated belief in her that she did not want to go that way, that she wanted something far more peaceful. And my father felt the same way. He had a DNR, he had a do not resuscitate, that was very clear. And I remember in the hospital when he was dying, they were trying to resuscitate him, and Mum was screaming at me on the phone because she had popped home to change her outfit. Not out of it, that sounds ridiculous. She popped home to refresh herself because we'd been there a few hours, and unfortunately she wasn't there as he started crashing. So she's screaming at me on the phone that he has a DNR, he has a DNR. And I wasn't able to, or I couldn't, some reason it felt wrong for me to stop the medical process, but actually that's what he wanted. And I really hope that I would be brave enough to do that now. But he never wanted to have a catastrophic brain injury from lack of oxygen, which was what was happening, and therefore live in a vegetative state. He wanted to have a good death, which is what the Health and Social Care Select Committee report talked about. And Mum absolutely echoed that. So their work throughout their lives always touched on difficult subjects and brilliant people talking about difficult things. And I'm not surprised they ended up with the decisions they ended up with.
It was a very difficult situation, of course, you found yourself in, and there are many perspectives on this subject, with some people very, very heavily opposed to it. They see it as assisted suicide, rather than just assisted dying. And I wonder, your mother would have heard a number of these arguments. Was she ever swayed by some of these viewpoints? Did it affect her in any way?
She has listened. She has listened. What she asked of the MPs to listen to her point of view, she has listened to other people. Otherwise, she is not the fair and rational woman that we know and love. She absolutely understands that people have differing points of view, that some people see that there's a sanctity of life, that some people see that there could be a coercive nature to this, that vulnerable elements of our society could be put at risk. But she and I have both looked through all the evidence and know that choice, according to the bill that has been set out, has an amazing set of safeguards around it. The safeguards are the cornerstone of this bill. At the moment, there aren't safeguards. At the moment, we're sort of living in a weird Wild West because nobody knows what to do and the law is a mess. So things can happen without regulation, whereas this would bring in regulation and legislation, and people would be able to monitor it very closely. I mean, it asks for the person that's asking to have an assisted death to apply 8 separate times. And those 8 separate times are scrutinized by doctors and lawyers or judges, depending upon how it proceeds with the committee stages. So there was no way that we didn't listen to other people's point of view, but the thing that kept coming back to us was this is choice, and faith is always choice. And I have many family members who are strong believers in the sanctity of life, but they would never believe that my mum should live in suffering and a prolonged existence just because of their faith.
Actually, you raise an interesting point there, Rebecca, and having spoken to people who are opposed to the bill, and you yourself will know the arguments very well, I'm sure, that issue of being coerced by others prematurely to end one's life, or even perhaps self-coercion came up. The idea that people might be guilty enough and feel that they need to end their lives because of pressure and burden they might put on others, came up also in the debate. And I wonder, did that issue ever come up among your family members?
What I would say about that is that there was an MP that stood up during the debate, and he said, this is not life or death, this is death or death. It was such a clear, bold statement that I hadn't heard before. I've heard people talk about this is not ending life, this is shortening death, but it makes it really clear that this is for terminal patients, people who have 6 months, 12 months left to live. It is not for somebody that is considered a burden on society. What a revolting phrase that is. Anybody that thinks they are a burden on society needs to have an adjusted view, because we need to value everybody, regardless of whatever supposed cost they may have. Everybody has a right to life. Kit Malthouse, the MP, said that we are not a nation of granny killers. And I think that is true. I think we, in the main, generally, absolutely adore our elders and respect them and look after them.
It's interesting, Rebecca, you raised that issue of safeguards, the safeguards that are there already, and the fact some are worried of the bill, allowing the scope to widen. And I wonder, if you could see any other potential safeguards that might really add another lock to the idea that the bill couldn't go any wider.
Well, I'm not a lawmaker. I'm not very well versed in politics. I've come to this very green, and it's been a very steep education for me in how contrary points of view can cause such emotive arguments. I've had a lot of threats against my life, against my family's safety, just because I believe in choice at the end of this world. So at the end of your life. So it's an interesting one for me that you talk about safeguards, when the people that are throwing around the violent terms are usually on the opposite side to me. We turn up to every debate, every campaign, every rally. I'm alongside a campaign called Dignity in Dying, and that's exactly how we try and proceed at all these rallies, with dignity, with compassion, with empathy, and we're hugging each other and we're chatting to each other. And I'm alongside people who are really suffering from very serious terminal diagnoses, including this wonderful woman called Sophie who has stage 4 terminal breast cancer and is allergic to opioids. So at the end of her life, she sees nothing but pain. She cannot have any pain relief. So how does the gentle death of palliative care work for someone like her? With the safeguards that we want, I think this is the most safe bill. In fact, there have been criticisms of it for having too many safeguards. I think at the moment, with the country not decided, with a bit of a rift going on, even though the majority are in favour of it, I think it's good to proceed with this level of safety at this time.
Referring to the stage where things are right now, you indicated your mother was unable to go for the first vote. You were there. How did both of you and your mother, react to the outcome?
It was so strange being there for the debate. I mean, it was a phenomenal moment that I will never, ever forget. It's an extraordinary place, as I'm sure you know, and it was filled to the rafters, which on a Friday is apparently quite unusual. There was not an ounce of seating left. And at the end of this very, very detailed debate that lasted 5 hours, and everyone said that was really short, I'm not sure I could have stood another 2 hours of it. But I know that there were more people that wanted to stand up and speak. But at the end of the debate, when they all went out to vote and the speaker shouted out the results, and then there was silence. And I looked across to someone who was sat on the opposite side, who I knew supported my point of view, and he put 2 thumbs up. And I was so relieved he did, because the silence meant that I wasn't sure what had happened, because usually there's a hurrah from whoever wins. But it's such a serious subject. And at the end of the day, if we win, or, it doesn't feel like winning. It just feels like the ability to choose has been given to you to die. That is not something you cheer. Obviously, it's not. That's why it was taken so seriously. So I leapt out of the room and ran down the stairs. There is absolutely no phone signal anywhere in the Houses of Parliament. So I had to run to the river to get through to Mum, where I spoke to her, and I felt dizzy and sick and confused, and she and I were both echoing this. It's brilliant, it's amazing, thank goodness it's got through this stage, but wow, there's a lot of work left to do. Goodness, there were a lot of people that were putting up barriers to it already, and and then she said to me, "Oh, I feel like I have to live for the next one now." I said, "Yes, of course you do, but you don't have to live for the next debate. You have to live forever for us, your family, and maybe think about the debate."
You know, Rebecca, you said you talked about how your mother reacted when you called her when you got out the Houses of Parliament to the River Thames to get a signal. And she said, the next one is coming up. So, of course, I guess you both recognise that at this stage it could be passed, it could be amended, it could even fail. Having played such a big part in the campaign, doesn't your mother want to kind of take a step back and rest and enjoy the rest of her life?
I tell you, she says to me, "I'm so bored with talking about dying." So I think she probably does, but I also think that she won't, because that's not the sort of person that she is. I don't think she'll let go of this. I think, we've both received so many messages and letters and emails from families that are going through very similar situations to us, that don't have the privilege of being able to afford the £15,000 to fly off to Switzerland, that are facing whatever will happen here and have no way out, or who have been through it before, who have either been to Switzerland or who have come across a loved one who is attempting suicide or has a botched suicide attempt. There's so many awful stories that are rolling around our heads, and so many people that we know are dependent upon this bill, that I don't think there's any way that we could stop now. The next stage is very difficult. It's the committee stage. The bill will be gone through line by line by line, and I can only hope it gets through. It's weird how our country is so recalcitrant on this topic, whereas we are leaders in so many other areas of health and social care. So I just hope that we are a bit more open to another way of looking at this.
Your mother mentioned in a recent interview that you'll be hosting the family Christmas event this year. I mean, assuming she is able to come, what will Christmas with Esther Rantzen be like this year? And what memories do you have of Christmases together?
Yes, I'm going to be hosting my mum and my sister at some point over the Christmas period. They're going to come and stay. We haven't worked out the logistics yet, but I'm definitely, whenever that is, we'll have a massive turkey. I think I've ordered 3. I don't know how much turkey one person can eat, but her plate is going to be full. She doesn't have much of an appetite at the moment, but she's going to have every single trimming, every single type of stuffing, many types of Brussels sprouts, because we have quite a few opinions on how those should be cooked. Christmas with Esther is always fun. It's magical. She's naughty. She's brilliant. She's fun. She loves games. So we're going to play all sorts of games. I've got some fantastic new board games, competitive and not so. Anyone that takes her on in Scrabble, good luck to you. I have never won against her, but it's just going to be lovely. And I've bought her some excessively luxurious presents, which I hope she won't mind, and many gorgeous fluffy slippers. So please don't tell her I've done that too. And I'm decorating absolutely every surface of my house. There is not one vertical, horizontal, diagonal that isn't covered in glitter and gold. So it's a bit much, but I love it.
I'm sure, Rebecca Wilcox, that pretty much everyone is wishing you and your family and your mother especially a wonderful Christmas celebration this year. Your mother, for people of my generation, I can say almost unanimously was a national treasure, has been a national treasure. And it's incredibly impressive that she's still doing so much to this stage. So more power to you, more power to her, and I wish you well.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and I'll pass on the message.
Polls show that around 2/3 of British people supported the idea of legalising some form of assisted dying. But it's the members of Parliament who will ultimately decide whether and in what form such a law can proceed. The bill was brought before the House of Commons by the Labour Party MP Kim Leadbeater, who only entered politics 3 years ago after her sister Jo Cox MP was murdered. My next guest is also a Labour MP, but he voted against the bill. Barry Gardner's history of service spans more than a quarter of a century, and as he told me, his decision was made after much soul-searching. Barry Gardner, thank you very much for joining the show. Now, when you entered Parliament in 1997 as a young MP, what sense did you have you'd be involved in debates of such importance to the national conscience?
I think anyone who thinks about going into politics, national politics, has to realize that there will be times when they are considering issues which really are about life or death. In my own parliamentary career, I've had that on a number of occasions. We've had, obviously, debates on war. We've had debates previously on assisted dying. So it's something which everyone who goes into politics at that level really should have at the forefront of their mind, and they should have thought very deeply about it. And I think that was one of the features of the recent debate that we had. It was a very thoughtful debate.
You voted against the bill and spoke in the debate. What key points did you want to make?
I think it's important that we recognize that when we're legislating, we are not simply expressing our own personal preference. And this was the fundamental internal conflict that I had with myself, because I could envisage myself being in that situation as outlined in this bill, with perhaps 6 months yet to live, with a terminal disease, and depending on the nature of that disease, perhaps wanting to avail myself of what this law would propose, which is to be able to have an assisted death. So at a personal level, I could see that. And I also listened very carefully to the stories of many of my colleagues and some of my constituents whose family members had been in that position, but hadn't been able to avail themselves of an assisted death. Some who'd taken their own life, but hadn't been able to have their final goodbyes with their family, because that would have implicated their family in assisting suicide, which is a criminal offense. So I had to think very hard about, was it my role to enact a law which would certainly bring comfort and relief to those people, or was it my role as a parliamentarian to pass legislation for the whole of society? And my fear was that if we passed the legislation that would undeniably bring that comfort and relief for so many, but I believe it would also have jeopardized those people who were, yes, in the situation at the end of their life with 6 months yet to live, but who thought, am I too much of a burden on my family? Should I just now opt for an early death? Is my living for another 6 months in this care home or with this care support going to eat so much up of the inheritance that my grandchildren might have on my death that I'm denying them their inheritance? And those are considerations that nobody at the end of their life should have to take into account.
Now, you're referring to guilt.
Misplaced guilt, because there is no guilt in living. You know, you're not guilty for being alive. You are a valued, a treasured human being. And where we lose our capacity to see each other as that, then our society really has changed fundamentally.
But Mr. Gardner, in terms of not having somewhere to go, there are people, such as the famous British broadcaster Esther Rantzen, who's in her mid-80s and suffering from lung cancer, who said if she doesn't have the option in the UK, she'll go to Switzerland, to Dignitas, an organisation that does offer assisted dying. So by not giving them the option in the UK, aren't you simply driving them out?
Well, no, it doesn't force them out, but what it does, unfortunately, and here I feel this very keenly, the point that you make, because as Esther Rantzen wrote to me, as she did to many MPs, and her own witness, her own testimony of her situation was very powerful. And she made the point, I have the luxury, I am wealthy enough to be able to go to Switzerland, but there are people who are not. And therefore, at the moment, as the law stands, as a rich person, I can avail myself of the remedy that I want. I can exercise the choice that I wish to make, but a poor person cannot. And that's a very powerful argument. But as I say, I don't think it overrides the responsibility that I certainly felt to legislate for everyone in society and not just for those who felt themselves in that particular situation as wanting to have the assisted death.
It's interesting to note that this debate comes at a time when Britain has evolved into a multicultural and multi-faith society with representations of those groups in Parliament too. And I wonder, when it comes to religion and faith, in many cases assisted dying is seen as suicide, which is considered a sin, how those MPs were able to rationalise the debate in terms of their own beliefs.
The great thing about the debate was that it was incredibly respectful. No matter which side of the debate you were on, everybody listened with care and attention to what was being said. And obviously many people of faith were influenced by their faith. But that was why this was made a vote of conscience. It was not a whipped vote. It was not one that, and quite rightly, it should not be something that you say, oh, well, we have a manifesto commitment on something as deeply important to one's own sense of who one is, because this is one of the most deep ethical questions that one can have, and it was right that it was a free vote. So I think religion did not actually ostensibly play a part in the debate. People weren't saying this is prohibited by God. but obviously their own sense of where they stood in the debate probably was. But they then had to construct their arguments in a way that appealed to the wider audience who may not have shared their religious beliefs.
Supporters of the bill, such as MP Kim Leadbeater, point to the safeguards they tried to build in, such as 2 doctors, a judge, 6 months of life expectancy, and heavy jail sentences for those who might ill-advise or coerce someone into assisted dying. So you had talked about wanting another level of assurance. What would that be?
I think there was a recognition, not just from myself, but from others, that there needed to be additional safeguards. For example, the situation of the judge signing it off, that is really a technical formality. It's not there's no investigative powers that the judge has. He simply has to check whether 2 doctors have agreed. I'm afraid that my view on the way in which the medical profession might operate in this is that it is not even doctors who spoke in the debate accepted that 6 months was a very movable feast. Sometimes they give a prognosis and that prognosis is entirely wrong. I think there was a concern that we would develop into 2 sets of doctors, those who were known to favor assisted dying and those who were not. And if you wanted that, you simply went to the ones who would sign you off without too much questioning. And I think that is, it was a safeguard, but I don't think it was an adequate safeguard.
Well, Mr. Gardner, the House of Commons is often known as a bit of a bullpit with impolite yelling and jeering, whereas many people describe this debate as very respectful and deeply moving. It seems to be quite a contrast from the usual scenes.
Yes, it really was, and goodness knows, I wish many more debates were conducted in that tone. I have to tell you, I think what made it very evident was there was one member of Parliament who entirely misjudged the mood of Parliament. I won't name who it was, but he sought to make a political point in his contribution. He sought to make a political point about the government's recent announcement of winter fuel payments and the taking away of the winter fuel payments for people who were not on the lowest band of benefit. And the whole House groaned. It was a gut groan. It was a, oh, and it seemed that all of Parliament, whichever side you were on, were saying, what are you doing? You're trying to turn this into a political debate. It's not. It's bigger than that, and we have to be bigger than that. And in that sense, I really think Parliament showed itself at its best because it was respectful. It was a debate which was characterized by listening and trying to respond seriously to the points that each other were making.
Yes, as you say, many people did describe this as parliamentary debate at its best. And I wonder what lessons could be learned from this, especially at a time when people around the world are starting to lose faith in politics.
Yes. Well, the obvious thing is let's have more free votes. Let's have more conscience votes. And perhaps MPs, instead of feeling that they have to troop through the lobbies after their whips, will think more deeply about the consequences of the legislation that they're passing. So I wouldn't like people to get the impression that the Commons is all, shallow and point scoring. It's not. But certainly this debate, I think, did the House proud. And even though I was on the losing side, I recognize that probably the majority of the British population, certainly in the polling that's been taken, were on the side of the bill. They wanted to see the bill go forward. And in that way, I have to respect democracy and hope that I'm wrong and that the the fears that I have for this bill will not come to pass.
Sir, I understand that your parents died, sadly, while you were still very young. And I wonder if you believe that palliative care has sufficiently improved since then to be a viable alternative to the thought of assisted dying.
Look, I think everybody in that debate was clear that we need to improve palliative care in this country. Palliative care can be wonderful, and I've seen some marvelous examples in my own constituency and in my own personal life. My own father, as you mentioned, he died of esophageal cancer, which is a really ghastly way to die. And so I think we all understand that we need better palliative care. But I don't want to make the mistake of thinking that palliative care can alleviate everything. People in hospices do wonderful jobs, absolutely wonderful jobs. But I do understand why there are some situations for some people where assisted death does seem the only viable option. And that obviously is what the majority of members of the House of Commons felt.
Well, this moment has been compared with other parliamentary debates on sensitive matters such as same-sex marriage, abortion, the repeal of the death penalty. And I wonder how it sits alongside debates that Parliament has to conduct on economic and social and defence matters.
Oh, gosh. It's a very different thing. And that is why I think it has to be a vote of conscience, where every member of Parliament has the freedom to examine themselves, examine who they are, and examine who they feel the country ought to be, and to do the best for everybody in society. I often think of the writings of John Stuart Mill, the great libertarian Enlightenment philosopher of the 19th century. And he said a very strange thing, or people thought it was very strange. He said the reason that he was against the universal suffrage, the universal vote, was he believed that if everybody had the vote, then, and in those days it was only men, he said, men would come to regard the vote as an expression of their own private preference rather than as an expression of their public responsibility. Now, I think I disagree with his premise, because I think people always did use the vote as an expression of their own private preference. But it's a really fundamental principle that I think legislators need to always keep in mind. They're not legislating for what they would like. They're not legislating for what they think would benefit them or their particular group of people, or any particular group of people. They're there to legislate for the whole of society. And I think if we lose sight of that, then we lose really something that's very fundamental to our democracy. So these debates are very different. The debates you mentioned, ethical debates about the nature of life, the way in which our society regards life, when it begins, when it should end, how it should be conducted. Fundamental questions, very different from the education budget, very different from the issues of work and pensions and employment and industry, which we're doing all the time. But when you get that many serious people in a room taking the issue seriously, one has to hope that we arrive at a conclusion which does fit with our society and which does ultimately benefit the whole of our community.
Barry Gardiner, thank you very much for taking the time to give us your perspective on this debate. Thank you, sir.
Great pleasure. Thank you.
Barry Gardiner ended our conversation by describing how he finds philosophy to be a helpful resource when considering decisions on important issues, including matters of life and death. Meanwhile, 4,000 miles, about 6,000 kilometres from London, A global gathering of philosophers took place in Saudi Arabia. Quality of life was the main theme of the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, featuring a diverse group of prominent thinkers. I was keen to hear their thoughts on the issues that were being debated in Britain. Dr. Joseph Cohen, I'm very happy to have a chance to chat with you. What's interesting is we're here at a philosophy conference in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia looking at something called quality of life. When it comes to quality of life, where does the whole concept of assisted dying fit in?
Excellent question. First of all, thank you very much. Assisted dying. A very famous, important philosopher, Martin Heidegger, wrote in Being and Time, 1927, wrote that no one can take dying away from the person. No one can take someone's dying away from him or her.
A right to die.
That is, the experience of dying is always unsubstitutable. It cannot be taken away from anyone. My dying will be my own dying. Your dying will be your own dying, and no one will be able to take that away from you or I. So the experience of dying is a singular experience, right? The right to die is the right to live through that experience. That is, the right to confront the experience of dying. I believe that this confrontation is a confrontation of human existence. Human existence needs to confront this dying because in this confrontation, it shows the possibility for the subject to project himself or herself into life.
But what's happened, Dr. Cohen, is that it's all become a legal matter now.
Right.
Not a philosophical one.
Right.
And that's where the complications come in. Who has the right to be involved, whether it's family members, friends, whatever? What right does the person who wants to die have? It's a very sensitive topic, and I can understand it because it brings in ethics, religion, and everything else. But when it comes to the idea of this debate, what should be the angles we as a society, global society, should look at?
I think we should definitely entertain the possibility of respecting human finitude. I think one of the major challenges of our time is to confront the finitude of our human existence. And in a certain manner, I think a lot of the problems of our epoch are linked to the idea that we can think beyond human finitude. We can think ourselves as almost infinite. I think we need to refocus on the possibility for human rationality to truly look at what the meaning of life is, what the quality of life is, in the horizon of finitude. And in this sense, death, although it is the absolute master, to speak like Hegel, for example, German philosopher, death is the absolute master. Death may not be that which is a radical interruption of humanity. On the contrary, it may precisely be the revelator of that which projects humanity. You see?
I guess the argument is death may be inevitable for all of us, but who should have a choice on when that event occurs?
But you see, even that question, although I understand why we're posing it, even that question is impossible to answer. Death is impossible to determine. Death is one's own, and yet at the same time, it's not one's own. I will be given my death, even if it's my own. You will be given your death, and it will only be yours, but it's not yours to have.
Let's pretend you're a lawyer defending someone who went through assisted dying.
Yeah.
How are you going to explain all this in court?
Yeah, it's obvious that the way I'm seeking to think the problem of dying is far removed from the idea of law, from the legal apparatus. Because I make a very sharp distinction between the law and justice. perhaps being just towards death, towards the question of death, involves or engages our thinking beyond the law. That is, outside the sphere of law.
I think the UK, which is debating this right now, is in a very difficult position because, of course, it's combining religion, philosophy, ethics, and legality. If it's not too personal a question, would you opt for assisted dying?
Very, very complex question. Myself, and speaking strictly for myself, yes, I would. I think that confronting the question of death, confronting one's dying, is the most radical human experience. And in a certain manner, the courage it takes to confront that experience needs to be given to human finitude, needs to be allowed for in human experience. So yes, I would certainly give each and every one of us as human existence, as existing humans, the possibility to confront this experience of dying.
And yet, it's seen as a sin in so many societies.
Yes.
How do we rationalize that?
Well, I think, yeah, it definitely is seen as a sin, but I think we can understand a certain manner of thinking the religious, even the ethical, in relation to human experience, which would also involve the idea of confronting the experience of dying.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, really it's a pleasure to be sitting here with you. And I'm going to start by asking you about the debate that's going on in the UK right now regarding assisted dying. The reason being is that raises so many issues. And again, from a philosophical perspective, there's the ethics, there's religion, there's legality. What's your take on what's happening?
That's a very difficult question. I personally, I'm not attached to life. And I'd be perfectly happy to die right now. I mean, you'd probably like me to finish the interview.
Last 20 minutes.
Yes, I'll do my best. But so, for me, life is a wonderful thing. And yet, I don't have that sense. I have a sense of responsibility that I'm taking up space, I'm doing so on and so forth. Now, I entirely understand all the back and forth about the issues, that people could be pressurized to take death rather than continue when they don't want to. And that sounds like a horrible thing. But I also understand people who are in pain. So it's just a question of trying to find arrangements so that people can be confident in the system.
I can say honestly, in 10,000 plus interviews over the years, I've never had anyone say they could be happy to die right now. I mean, I've heard people say they're not scared of death. Mm-hmm. They're not worried about, death. It's an inevitability. But I'm just baffled. Sorry, I'm going to delve into this a bit, but just ask, where does this detachment from life come?
Well, I've just had a wonderful life. I mean,
there's a lot more, hopefully, isn't there?
Well, I'm 74 years old, so not that much more.
74 is young.
Yeah, to some people. I mean, no doubt if I do live to 94, I'll think about when I was 74 and think, oh, I was young back in those days. But no, I'm perfectly happy with the idea that I've had a great life. I think I've done some good things and some bad things, and I just don't want to ruin it. Aristotle says, you can only tell whether a person was happy, had eudaimonia is his word, after they're dead. And right now, I think I would be on the plus side. But maybe I'll go off and do something wrong and wish I died before this interview if I say the wrong thing today.
Professor Fausto Fresopi, thank you so much for spending some time with us. The big debate currently in society, certainly in the UK, is this concept of assisted dying. And what that does is it raises a lot of questions about what ethics are. From a philosopher's perspective, how do we set ethical boundaries?
So the problem is, in my view, don't fall in eugenetics. We already known from many decades ago. The problem is assisting dying is voluntarily or willingly asked from the patient. Why not? There is no ethic boundaries. But the ethic boundary will be strong or too strong when the society decide when is the case or not. And precisely where the point on which philosophy have something to say is if there is the case or not. It's not a matter of taxonomy if there is if it's the case or not, but a matter of general conception of life and when a life is worthy to live to the end, even with sickness, even with handicaps, and so on and so on. In my view, the extreme boundary and the extreme danger is the eugenetics. When a society settle taxonomies to say, okay, we can intervene for assisting that.
Let me get on to what has been the subject of this philosophy conference, quality of life, because that's actually the precursor to this debate.
Yes.
And I guess it comes down to how we judge quality of life. Now, there's obviously medical illness and serious conditions that warrant a different level of discussion. There's quality of life in terms of what people perceive as wealth or capability, financial capability. What is quality of life in your terms?
There's a very sharp distinction in the history of philosophy between quantity and quality. Quantity, we all know, quantity is opulence, a mass of goods, and quality is something quite different. I think quality is the capacity to reveal what is singular in life, what is non-negotiable in life, what is radically singular and particular. Now, I believe that each and every one of us must think that problem of singularity through, must think the relationship between what is singular and what is qualitative. Now, if you ask me as a philosopher, I will tell you that what is most important in this qualitative ideal is time, temporality, how to use our time, how to think through the utilization of our time, of our temporality as existence, but also our time with others, our time that we share with others in our communities, in our families, even in regards to our country, etc.
My mother, as a personal note, my mother went through years of Parkinson's disease, and at one point she said to me, as she was losing her physical capabilities, her mind was still sharp, she said, "This is not living, it's existence." That resonated with me. So how do we determine what a person is entitled to in terms of quality of life?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, because you're marking the distinction between life and existence. Now, perhaps I should make something quite obvious. Existence, the word existence, means actually to step out of oneself, transcend oneself. It comes from the existence, it means to come out of oneself. I'm very attached to this idea. I'm very attached to this idea because I believe that human life must constantly and incessantly transcend itself. One must transcend itself, out of itself, into a betterment of oneself, into the qualitative ideal of a temporality that stretches out. The main problem for me when I think about the idea of quality of life is that we often reduce temporality. We often reduce temporality to a particular goal. I want such and such a thing. I want to achieve such and such a job. I want to achieve such and such a situation. We restrict temporality to succeeding in a particular goal or a particular appropriation of a goal. I would rather and remaining faithful to this idea of existing, I would like us to think quality of life as stretching out time.
This leads me almost perfectly onto where society has gone in terms of quality of life. I mean, many people, myself sometimes also, bemoan the fact that we've become so short-term in our thinking. We have lost as society our understanding of the difference between need and want.
Yes.
And it's driven very much by want, so much more than need. And that kind of detaches us from the real needs on this planet, between societies and cultures and so on. So when we think of quality of life in those terms, how can we bring ourselves back to understanding these differences? When you have a conference looking at the quality of life, how do you get people to consider this and not think short term and materialistically?
Yeah, no, I think I mean you're putting your finger on a very important topic, and I think a topic that will be discussed throughout our conference. That is, how can we instill in our lives, in the quality of our lives, the possibility to invent or to think outside the box, to be very pragmatic in my speech. That is, think outside the box, invent outside the determined modalities of our thinking. You were asking me about where has society gone. I feel today, politically, sociologically, anthropologically, even geographically, I feel that we have reached a point where our humanity is extremely determined in the simple repetition of inherited ideas. I believe what we need is to reinvent these inherited ideas.
But what are these inherited ideas based on?
They're based on a tradition, and I'm all for the enhancement of our tradition, but I'm also thinking that our humanity, and this is why I'm so attached to this project here in Riyadh, is that we are incessantly seeking to reinvent our tradition. That is, take our tradition and our different traditions. It's an international conference. People from all walks of life, not only philosophers, scientists, not only people from the Middle East, but also people from all over the world are coming to Riyadh to take what our traditions have given us and invent a commonality of humanity. And this is what I feel and fear we have lost in many of our societies. The power to invent and reinvent what we receive.
The conference, the Riyadh International Philosophy Conference, the theme for this year has been quality of life. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, where this fits into what you might define as quality of life.
Well, in my talk, I talked about how the quality of life has become the slogan in well-being league tables put out by the World Health Organization and other similar organizations. And I just feel that they have entirely missed the point. That too easily this becomes an instrument for governments to be competing against each other, to be higher up in the league table. They're more likely to go higher up in the league table if they're keeping the middle class happy rather than addressing poverty or systemic issues like climate change. And so I just think that the whole emphasis is wrong. And so in my talk, I was talking about poverty and hunger, and why I would prefer to see that as the issue, and global poverty. It shouldn't be countries competing against each other to be better than the other one. We should be trying to pull up the people who need the most help.
So when it comes to the term quality of life, what's your definition of it?
Oh, I don't have a definition. I'm not that kind of philosopher, thankfully. So I just think the phrase, which basically, not many people know this, but it gained currency because President Lyndon Johnson used it in a talk he gave in Madison Gardens.
Yeah.
Thank you, yes, in 1964. And then all these economists went off and thought, oh, that's what we should be talking about, not GDP, but quality of life. And so that's why they tried to measure it and so on. But I think that, again, it's always going to be different for different people and different cultures. And I think trying to make this a competition is a mistake.
Do you find the world of philosophy is a shrinking one?
Oh, that's a very provocative, in its own sense, it's a very provocative question. At times, I do feel philosophy is shrinking. That is, I do feel philosophy is becoming ever more so specialized and structured only on the repetition of its own tradition, which is an extremely rich tradition. And certainly we need that form of specialization in universities and research centers. And I'm a professional philosopher, so I'm not going to criticize that. But at the same time, I do feel that what philosophy really needs and how philosophy can really help, because we always say philosophy cannot help our society, they're abstract and they're living in their ivory towers in Cambridge and Oxford or wherever, but where philosophy can really truly help is to develop and deploy in what is common, what is to reveal in what is common, what is singular. That is, from where we can reinvent ourselves. I think philosophy has a task today to insist on the reinvention of our humankind.
Is the problem that philosophy is considered elite? Is that the issue?
No, it's one of the problems. It's one of the problems, and I think philosophy has a great responsibility in that elite manner of appearing, and I think philosophy must, in a way, come down from that elite status and become much closer to our everyday life. But at the same time, I would never want philosophy to let go of its radicality, and its radicality is what? Its radicality is, again, the possibility for the subject to transcend itself, for the human subject to transcend itself, to become other than itself, to reinvent itself.
Do you, as a philosopher, often change your ideas, your philosophies?
Constantly. And I think, if I may be a little bit provocative even about philosophy, I think one of the great dangers of philosophy and of philosophy as a discipline is to always pretend that coherence is the sole motivator for human beings. I think there is a value to uncoherence, to the possibility of constantly and incessantly changing to adapt to our singular existential situations. The situation of 1968 is not the same situation in 2024. We need to have not only evolved from 68 to 2024, but rethink the very concepts that were used in 68, rethink those concepts for 2024. That means constantly and incessantly change.
Do you think there has been a change in this global society that's now being created by the internet, the World Wide Web, interconnectivity at a global level? Is there a change in philosophy? Is there a better exchange of understanding of ideas?
Yeah, I would say the culture interact when there is, at first and foremost, commercial exchange. So the beginning of the Renaissance, the rise of Columbus, then the rise of the companies to the east, the Jesuit company already increased the knowledge from the west to the east, and so on and so on. Now we live in a globalized world. This is my matter of study, in a complex world. And in this case, of course, technologies can help to a dialogue, but I will say as a platform, not as a form of dialogue. The dialogue must be established person to person in such conferences, in long dialogues, not with smart messages and all what the platforms provide to us.
Thinking of different cultures, is philosophy as a subject, is it universal, or is it very much divided along cultural lines and, I guess religious lines, ethnic lines?
Well, obviously there's been a huge variety of philosophies, and I'm not a mainstream philosopher. I've done quite well. I got a job, but I'm not one of those people who is trying to conform to whatever the fashion is. So quite honestly, I think a lot of current philosophy is not very interesting. I think it's geared towards an academic audience. It doesn't know how to get beyond that. It's geared towards trying to publish as many articles as possible. And so I think philosophy has lost its way. And one of the luxuries of having a job with tenure is that I can do what I want.
What would be your version of what philosophy should be then?
I think it should be trying to hear voices from more different people. And that's why I think that to a certain extent, what we call Western philosophy is somewhat played out, at least in terms of what it's become. I'm not denying the wonderful classics that I enjoy studying. So I'm not one of these people against the great books, as it were. But I do think that if we could hear more from people from India, from Saudi Arabia, from Algeria, wherever. I just think that that is what will refresh and renew philosophy, because it's coming from different conditions, different contexts. People have different intuitions depending on where they're brought up.
Well, my intention would be to speak with you a lot longer, but I'm going to ask you a final question as we are running out of time. And that would be, is philosophy as a concept, as a source of inspiration and kind of debate in society, is it dying?
I want to make a very firm distinction here. I think if I look at academic philosophy as it's practiced in many elite institutions, I would say it deserves to die. If you look at the issues that ordinary people have that we need to introduce or reintroduce back into philosophy, then it'll never die.
Professor Robert Bernasconi, what a pleasure. Thank you.
I enjoyed it too.
Thank you. Professor Versopi, thank you so much for joining me on the show.
Thank you too.
Thank you, sir. Well, Dr. Joseph Cohen, what a pleasure. You've provoked a lot of thought here, I hope, with the people watching. Certainly have with me. Real pleasure. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Some thoughts there on how the ancient tradition of philosophy can be applied to very current issues that are being passionately debated in some parts of the world today. Thanks to all my guests for their respectful, considered and sensitive contributions they brought to this episode. I'm Riz Khan from me and the team. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Al Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, and with the holiday season upon us, we've decided to take a look back at some of the highlights from the last few weeks. Hello and welcome to the programme. The US President-elect Donald Trump is pledging big tariffs on the United States' three largest trading partners, namely Canada, Mexico and China, where he plans to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico until they clamp down on drugs and migration. Well, Beijing has responded, saying that they remain open to dialogue with the United States. Canada, meanwhile, says it is, quote, essential to the US energy supply. Well, for more, we're joined now by the Canadian-American businessman and Shark Tank investor Kevin O'Leary. Thank you very much indeed for being with us once again here on Al Arabiya News. I'm assuming you're not particularly surprised because on the campaign trail, after all, Donald Trump said that his favourite word in the English language was none other than tariffs.
I'm not surprised, actually. Security at the border is not just a Mexican-U.S. issue, it's a Canadian-U.S. issue. And for a long time in previous administrations, going back as far as the NORAD agreements, the U.S. has wanted Canada to pay its fair share, as they like to say, to secure the northern border against what was once the USSR and now Russia. So they concern themselves with tying that up. Now, in Trump's case, these tariffs are all about pre-inauguration negotiation, right? Even with NATO, just visited Miami Beach recently. All of this is positioning towards what's going to be the negotiation between Canada and the U.S. around the Mexican-Canadian deal. It's an extension of NAFTA. Most people remember it as that, but this will be the third time it's negotiated. And this is a starting position. What complicates the situation right now is Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, had a 2-hour conversation last night with Trump. However, he's on his way out. Trudeau probably isn't going to last another 7 or 8 months. And so, unfortunately, the parliamentary system is not quite like the U.S. The end game for a prime minister that's losing a majority mandate is they just throw him out. You saw it happen in England just a few months ago. It's going to happen in Canada. And the real negotiation is going to be with the head of the Conservative Party, a man named Pierre Poilievre, who's currently a private citizen, represents the opposition, but he's the person that will take on this responsibility by the time these negotiations start and Trump is president. So it's a very delicate situation. Obviously, there's no way you can put 25% tariffs on a partner like Canada, where all the food and energy and electricity and gas and oil and paper and minerals and all that stuff flow into the U.S. And so all of this is just a pre-positioning, and it's not a big surprise to anybody. It's just this unique situation where Trudeau is lame duck and the new prime minister is not there yet.
Because that's the situation in Canada. And of course, Canada sounding extremely alarmed by the idea of a 25% tariff, saying it will have a devastating impact on workers and jobs. But it's not just in Canada that it would have a devastating impact on workers and jobs. It would also have a devastating impact on workers in the United States, wouldn't it?
Yes. You know, you have to think about all of this as not a sales tax, not a burden on the American economy at all. The real issue here, you know, sort of the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room, is not Canada or Mexico or even the European countries. It's China. The U.S., in fact, Europe, I'd argue, is in an economic war with China and has been since 1999, when they came into the WTO, making all these promises about playing by the rules, and they've never done that. And so IP theft, cheating, stealing, dumping of commodities in various markets, all of this has come to a head. And during the Biden administration, you know, they didn't take off the tariffs against China. It's just that Trump is now ratcheting it up to get them to the table. Most tariff deals are reciprocal. That's what the agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico is. It's a reciprocal tariff agreement. Same with Germany on automotives at 10%. But this China thing is going to DEFCON 1. It's getting really, really extreme. And I expect, rather than risk trade with the U.S., the supreme leader, who only gets to remain supreme if everybody's employed in China, will get over to the U.S. and try and work something out. And that's because Trump is just making it so difficult. And I don't think it's really going to affect the U.S. economy. There hasn't been much effect on tariffs at all. We've had a very strong economy at the consumer level, stock markets at all-time high. It was a lot of political rhetoric. The tariffs would ruin the economy. It just hasn't happened. And now we're going into the end game, or the beginning of the game, depending on which way you want to look at it. But I expect that this will really be all about China and will not have that much effect on the American economy.
So how come China got away with it seemingly lightly with a 10% hike in tariffs, when in fact Donald Trump had talked on the campaign trail about something a bit more like 60%, hadn't he?
Yeah. I mean, the whole presidential election is over and the country's operating as if Trump is already president. You don't see a lot of foreign leaders going to Washington. They're all showing up in Mar-a-Lago right now. So we only have 54 days left. We're going through a holiday season here in the U.S. Trump has almost picked his entire cabinet. I mean, it's incredible at the pace at which he's done this. And most people like the picks. There's a couple of controversial ones, but Trump knows he only has 24 months in which he has a majority mandate, because there are going to be midterm elections, and usually the House flips then, and you don't have as much power. So he's going to try and ram all this stuff through in the next 2 years, and he's got a mandate. He won an incredible, no other way to describe it than a landslide. I mean, he decimated the Democrats in every swing state and then some, and even won the popular vote. So he's not waiting around to debate anything with the White House or any Democrats. He's just firing up the engines, and he's going to plow right on through town.
The reason given for singling out China relates to the drug fentanyl. And I just want to ask you whether you think that's first of all, is that the real reason? And then I also want to ask you, as an extension of that question, why this is such a serious issue in the United States?
Well, fentanyl's been an issue. Opioid addiction, huge issue. Porous border, Mexico. Drug cartels, murders in small American towns. All of this has made headlines in the last 4 months. But it's not just fentanyl. The dumping of commodities in the U.S. market and the lack of IP protection, spyware in the form of TikTok, scheduled to shut down January 19th at midnight, all of this is boiling and simmering just below the surface. And so, you know, this is really about how tough Trump is going to get on China. And he really wants, you know, the Canadians to make sure that once he seals off the Mexican border, Canada is not a problem. So that's what he told Trudeau last night. Trudeau won't be around to execute on that, but the message is clear to the Canadian people. It's not going to be business as usual. They're going to have to spend more money on maintaining that border and not making it porous, because there's been evidence of illegal immigration coming through the Canadian border in Quebec or in British Columbia, all of these places, and so, in Alberta as well. That's a very big open border, so it's going to have a lot more patrolling. Luckily, there's a lot of technology, a lot of drone technology, monitoring technology, infrared technology, satellite technology. This just has to be executed by the Canadians, and it's going to be made a priority. It's all going to happen. But fentanyl is, yes, important, but just one issue. And so Trump is just taking an attitude. Border means both borders. It means Canada and it means Mexico.
Sure, and I'm just wondering, I mean, just looking at the Donald Trump lineup for his inner circle, and of course Elon Musk is a big part of that. I mean, whether you see him having some involvement in this idea about imposing these tariffs, and also what you think he's going to bring to the table, just generally speaking, with regards to government efficiency.
Well, there's never been anything quite like Doge, if that's what you want to make reference to, because it's worth talking about. Two private citizens that have incredible executional skills, particularly in the case of what Elon Musk has achieved. He has a lot of respect within bipartisan votership. I mean, if you want to start saving money in government, it's not just a Republican or Democratic issue. And they want to talk about erasing trillions of dollars of waste. Most people know the federal government's full of waste. It's fat, it's sassy, it's never been controlled, deficits have never been higher. Nothing wrong with that. So you're getting Trump 2.0, which looks like he'll be a little bit more stable, plus you're adding a whole dash of Doge to make the whole thing more interesting. Most people are going to cut a pretty broad swath for this administration for an extended period of time, at least 2 years, to see what they can achieve. So there's a fair amount of euphoria here in the U.S. right now amongst business leaders. Taxes will remain stable. The regulatory environment will be stripped away. Pretty well everything Biden tried to do will be erased. That's just the nature of presidential politics. We're going to be lighting up natural gas export, LNG, almost immediately. Executive orders will become flying out of the White House on the 21st of January. A lot of change coming. And it really was two different divisions in terms of the vision for each way the country was going to be run between the Democrats and the Republicans, and the voting constituency, by a landslide choice, decided they would go back the Trump way of doing things. And that's just the way it is.
Yeah, and just lastly, just to wrap up this conversation, I mean, we have had a pretty decent peek behind the curtain with regards to what Trump 2.0 is going to look like. We've been talking about tariffs, we've been talking about DOGE. I mean, what are your sort of forecasts? What are your predictions as to where things head to with regards to job creation and trade deficit reduction under the new Trump presidency?
Well, you can see it now. One index of the optimism is the stock market itself hitting new highs, but there's also a lot of optimism in small business in America, which represents about 62% of job creation. They're waiting to see all the regulations peeled away. The Trump picks for cabinet positions are different than Trump 1.0. Most of these people are seasoned veterans. They're going to be around for the full 4 years. It's not going to be as much volatility. Trump is thinking legacy at this point. This is definitely his last election other than the midterms, but he wants to leave the country better than he found it. Every president does. And he is building a platform within the White House that's going to be remarkably different than the last time. There was a lot of volatility, if you want to use that word. But even he has said, look, I'm not going to make the same mistakes. I'm not going to hire people that don't know what they're doing. I'm going to get veterans that understand the system. He's done that in commerce. He's done that in Treasury. Health is a little controversial with Kennedy, but I actually think Kennedy will make it through the gauntlet because he has a lot of interesting ideas about food choices, of which I'm a huge advocate of. I'm just one person. But the whole idea is 2.0 is a more seasoned Trump, a more stable Trump, a more experienced Trump with an added dash of DOGE. So a little extra cleaning fluid, if you want to call it that.
Sure. And just lastly, because I said that was the last question, but I actually have one more question to you, because I think last time you came on our channel, you talked about cryptocurrency, Bitcoin approaching the 100,000 mark, sort of slowly back and forth a little bit, around the 93,000 mark today. But I'm just wondering whether you think the Trump administration, the incoming Trump administration's got grand plans to regulate, or what you think they're going to change with regards to cryptocurrency regulation.
Yeah, when I last talked to you, Bitcoin was trading around 60, and it's now around 90. So a huge increase. The optimism around settling the regulatory environment around crypto in the United States and digital payment systems. Gensler's on his way out. We're talking about getting a crypto czar. CFTC, which is the commodities regulator, has been rumored to get more power around things like, is Ethereum a commodity or a security? All these things are going to get resolved. There's a stablecoin act floating around Congress right now to make the American dollar the de facto trading system for digital currency. All of this stuff is coming in the first 24 months. And so that's why you're seeing these markets so optimistic. The granddaddy digital currency, of course, is Bitcoin. It's the one that institutions want. And as soon as it's regulated and the lawsuits go away from the exchanges, SEC is suing Coinbase, the U.S.'s largest exchange, things will settle down, and you'll find 1 to 3% allocations institutionally, which will add another $1 trillion worth of demand. And so I think crypto is probably a pretty good bet. And certainly within our portfolios, we've added to it, and we're doing some rebalancing because no one saw this increase in such a short period of time with Bitcoin. I mean, if your mandate is you're only allowed to have 20% in crypto and no more than 5% in any one position, you've blown out the walls with what's occurred with Bitcoin. So we have had to do some rebalancing. But that's why you see the price peel back a little bit. I'm not the only person in that situation. It's happening all around the world.
Okay, well, that really was the last question. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again here. Kevin O'Leary, thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
Well, the US President-elect Donald Trump's tariff threats against Canada, Mexico and China have shaken up the currency markets. The dollar jumped as much as 2.3% against the Mexican peso. It rose 0.7% against the Canadian dollar, and on the Chinese side, the yuan was up just by 0.1% in offshore trading. Well, let's get some more analysis now. We can speak to Ambassador John Verrineau, who was a trade negotiator under President George W. Bush. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Obviously, tariffs are one way of the US defending its economy, but it also has implications for US consumers, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. The evidence suggests, and many studies have been done that show that consumers, U.S. consumers, are paying a large portion of the tariffs that were put in place since 2018.
So what you're saying is that companies would typically pass on this additional cost to consumers by simply raising prices?
Yes, it can vary depending on the leverage between the importer and the exporter, of course. But for the most part, U.S. consumers are paying for these tariffs.
And just casting our minds back to the year 2018, when Donald Trump was last in office, and there were more tariffs during that administration. I mean, what happened then? Were there retaliatory tariffs put in place against the United States?
Yes, every action has a reaction, of course. So when the U.S. put tariffs in place, other countries, including China, put tariffs in place in response to that. And I would expect the same reaction this time from our trading partners.
But back then, did they have a detrimental effect, those retaliatory tariffs, on U.S. exporters, on job creation? What was the fallout?
Yeah, the economic studies have shown that U.S. exports were hurt in various markets. The U.S. Put in place a special subsidy program to help U.S. soybean farmers, for instance, who lost market share in China. So these interventions through tariffs have tremendous knock-on effects throughout the economy, which is why, at least until recent years, there was a tremendous effort over the previous 80 years to reduce, if not eliminate, tariffs. So they have a lot of knock-on effects throughout the economy.
And in terms of achieving the desired effect, which, according to the Trump administration, is to crack down on drugs and illegal migration, do you think they're likely to work this time?
Well, illegal drugs and illegal immigration are very complex problems. I think the president-elect is correct to want to reduce illegal flows across the border of both, but there's also a demand side of that problem of drugs, and I would like to see the president-elect announce what he plans to do to help reduce demand among U.S. users and help those who are addicted to these drugs, in addition to efforts to try to stem the flow across borders. But addressing only the supply side has proven over time not to be sufficient. You definitely have to address the demand side. And then secondly, there's a question of whether tariffs are the appropriate tool to be using to address these problems. Historically, trade agreements have been about trade and trade alone, and have not included these other issues, however important they are. But there are other channels and other remedies available to the government and to work with other governments to address those that should be used instead of tariffs as the only solution. But as the president-elect likes to describe himself as tariff man, tariffs is his immediate go-to tool for any sort of problem.
Okay, so let's just look at this from the point of view of who comes off worst. A 25% tariff on all products that enter the United States from Mexico and Canada. Obviously, this is going to have a knock-on effect. We've talked about tit-for-tat tariffs. Who comes off worse out of this, the United States or Mexico and Canada?
Well, I think it's hard to say. I think both are losers, at a time when, the president-elect won in no small part because of his focus on inflation and U.S. voters' concerns about inflation. Even though inflation rates have declined, prices are much higher now. And now we're going to see 25% increase in a lot of lumber products, for instance, from Canada that are used in U.S. housing. So I think Canadian exporters will suffer, and U.S. consumers and home buyers will suffer.
But do you think any of this is actually really going to happen? Or do you think this is part of a negotiating technique, some posturing ahead of some talks on how perhaps trading arrangements can be changed? What do you think the strategy is here?
Well, I think we'll see both. I mean, some of it is no doubt a negotiation, but I do believe that the president-elect believes tariffs are good for America. So I don't think it is purely a negotiating tactic, although that's part of it. But negotiations have to be successful, and in order to eliminate these tariffs, if it is an opening gambit. And countries, frankly, don't like to be bullied. And when I think there are problems that are at the borders with Mexico and Canada that can be solved and should be solved. But I'm not sure that it sets the correct tone for negotiations if you start with announcing on social media plans to take unilateral action of this magnitude.
And obviously, lots of countries have reacted to this news. Well, in particular, Canada, Mexico, and China, the countries concerned. I mean, what struck you about the sort of reaction that we've heard from them? Do you get the impression that, from what they're saying, these tariffs might have the desired effect, whatever that may be?
Well, these are complex problems of illegal drug importation and illegal immigration in the U.S. These are very complex problems that people have been working on for a long time. So redoubling those efforts, I think, is a very good thing. But I think to the extent that tariffs will stay in place until these complex problems are solved would suggest that these tariffs are going to be in place for a long time, because these are vexing problems that have been around and will continue to be around. But as far as the initial reaction from both Canada and Mexico and their trade officials and government officials, I think, they are understandable. They're trying to be, restrained in their response, given the stakes. And they are trying, I think, at least in their initial statements, to temper their, at least the public discussion of these, although I suspect in private there must be great dislike of the approach that has been taken in this unilateral faction.
You're quoted in the Washington Post today as saying the following: when the United States imposes import taxes on foreign goods, other countries will hit back. We've talked a bit about retaliatory tariffs already, but do you think we are here on the brink of a full-blown trade war?
Well, I don't know. Obviously, I hope not, but every action has a reaction, and negotiations, everyone likes to negotiate from a position of strength. That's understandable. That's good negotiating tactics. But no one likes to be bullied either. So you could see, a mood among negotiators among the countries where it's a very unwelcoming and challenging environment to reach a negotiation, because neither side feels they have the space to agree to something without looking domestically like they were bullied into something. And, in China, for instance, there's a history of the Opium Wars. And I'm sure it's not lost on some Chinese that they are being now threatened with these tariffs in response to an illegal drug use at a time when many in China still remember the Opium Wars, where their ports were bombed because they would not accept opium from Western sources.
And obviously looking at China in the year 2024, with this threat of a 10% additional tariff being placed on the country, I mean, it's not 100% clear, is it, what President-elect Donald Trump has in mind with regards to this additional 10%? I mean, what do you think his options are?
Well, you know, in the campaign, as you know, he threatened tariffs of up to 60%. So I think some reaction to the 10% may be welcome news that 10 is better than 60%. But I think that would be it would be imprudent to assume that this is the end of the threats of increases to tariffs on goods from China.
Okay, and of course, the Chinese embassy in Washington hitting out about these latest tariffs. They say that there will be losers on all sides if there is a trade war. Are they right?
Yes, absolutely. You know, it's why the Bretton Woods agreements in World War II, following World War II, there was great effort through the WTO and bilateral efforts to reduce tariffs, because they have proven to be very unhelpful interventions in the economy that ultimately hurt consumers, especially low-income consumers, and create opportunities for crony capitalism where friends of the government in power get special dispensation and relief from tariffs, and others who are less politically favored are hurt. So the record is quite clear that these tariff interventions at the end of the day are far more hurtful than helpful.
And just lastly, as I mentioned at the beginning, you were a trade negotiator under President George W. Bush. How unprecedented is all of this, the imposition of tariffs or the threat of tariffs at the beginning of a presidential term? Or is this part of the political cycle? Is this just the sort of thing that world leaders do to sort of make their mark when they take up the reins of power? What are your thoughts?
Well, you know, nothing is new under the sun. So there have been periods, you know, at least in the U.S., which I'm more familiar with our own history, is, you know, turn of the century, 1900s, there were very steep tariffs. There was a belief that tariffs were good, but that was proven through years and years of evidence that they're not helpful. They are helpful to a minority of companies that are politically favored, but harmful to the vast majority of consumers and the vast majority of other producers who don't enjoy political favoritism. So this is not new, but it's been about 100 years since these notions that tariffs are a good thing have been in the minds of those in power. So it's not new, and I suspect we will relearn old lessons of history, but that seems to be the nature of the human project.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. We really appreciate your time today, Ambassador John Verano. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Now, just to remind you, on the 23rd of November 2006, the former KGB agent Alexander Litvinenko was poisoned by a cup of tea at a London hotel. Well, on his deathbed, he blamed the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Well, Litvinenko, who had worked for the Soviet KGB and its successor, the FSB, fell out of favor with the Russian authorities after allegedly refusing to kill the oligarch Boris Berezovsky. Well, arrested multiple times, he fled Moscow in the year 2000 and sought asylum in the United Kingdom, where he became one of Putin's most vocal critics. Well, the 18th anniversary of his death was marked during the course of the weekend. Well, we can cross now to London and speak to Marina Litvinenko, the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, who was killed almost exactly 18 years ago. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been 18 years since your husband was killed. Just tell us, first of all, how did you mark that anniversary?
You said it's 18 years since my husband was killed here in London, and I think it was mostly one of the first serious attack outside of Russia and killing enemies or oppositioner of Putin. But now in 18 years, we have more and more people who've been killed or died because they've been against of Vladimir Putin. This was a very quiet day for two of us, for me and for our son, Anatoly. And we went to cemetery and just tried to remember my husband and his father as a very good man. And I can't believe it's soon almost 20 years since he died.
Indeed, it doesn't feel like so very long ago that we were covering that story in the media. Of course, you live in London and you continue to speak out against President Vladimir Putin, whom your husband blamed for his death before he actually died from his poisoning. Just tell us a little bit about the sort of activities and the kind of activism you're engaged in.
It was even not activism. I think it was my right to understand who killed my husband. And it was not possible to bring this case to the proper court because people who was named as a first suspect were in Russia. And Putin immediately refused to extradite them to UK. And of course, they didn't want to go themselves. And only way was to bring this case to inquest or to public inquiry. And it did happen in 10 years after my husband, Alexander Litvinenko, was killed in 2015. And only in 2016, we had a verdict. It means all these 10 years, I didn't feel myself as an activist, but as a person who fight the truth and to understand how president of a big country as Russia might be a criminal. He was pointed in a public inquiry report. He was not named as a person who killed my husband, but he's definitely responsible for my husband's death and for use of radioactive material, polonium-210. And it's not a proper, maybe, verdict, but one day after what Putin done during this almost 25 years being as a head of Russia, this will be one part of this huge case against Vladimir Putin.
And before he was poisoned, your husband said that Putin will start a war, millions of people will die, he said. He also said words to the effect that this monster, talking about Vladimir Putin, must be stopped. I'm just wondering what it was about that angered Moscow so much and what you think he envisaged happening as the years went by.
It was a lot of things what might or irritated or became angry with my husband. But Sasha, my husband, always said, this is people that are criminals. They don't care about state. They don't care about people in Russia. They mostly care about money and power and controlling this criminal business. And if you started to do something what this business might be cut or compromise, they might kill you. And this is exactly what happened to any other people as my husband, Alexander Litvinenko, when they tried to stop. I can't call this as even corruption. This was like an international crime. They tried to corrupt people all around the world. And this is, we see what is happening now during this war against Ukraine. How is this everything difficult? And knowledge of my husband as a former security officer was very important here in UK or in Europe to explain this. And I think it became as a very special point why he was killed at the end.
And obviously predicting a war in which millions of people were killed, which were the words that your husband used before he was died. Do you think he envisaged that the day that would come, that the situation we're in now, that there would be a war between Russia and Ukraine involving the West to a significant degree?
It's very difficult to make any prognosis. Only things what I always try to say, Putin tried to bring as many countries involved in this situation. And countries as United States, United Kingdom, and European Union, they just too long waiting for reaction. If it's all happened in 2022, when Putin just started this war and stopped him and provide all weapons what Ukraine was needed, it would be finished much sooner. And not so many people might died, and so many children might died. And now we can see how more and more people dying in this war. And this situation would be worse if, again, European countries and United States, will start to calm down Putin or trust him for what he is saying. Putin must be stopped. And Ukraine, what is fighting already for almost 3 years, need to be supported, and it's not going to be any third world war if it will be finished sooner as possible.
But of course, the Biden administration and it seems the United Kingdom as well have given Ukraine permission to use some very significant weaponry in the last couple of weeks. And that's obviously angered Russia. President Putin has issued some pretty chilling warnings about where things could head to from here. How seriously do you think we should take those warnings?
But this was from a very beginning. When this war started, Putin tried to frighten all leaders, saying it's my game. I'm fighting against Ukrainian Nazis, how he called them. But of course, we know it was not any Nazis. And he already said you might use nuclear weapon because we already developed a lot of new missiles, but it never happened. Even after Ukrainian army just went to Russian territory and now almost 3 months staying in this part of Russia. And this has never happened. Why now you have to believe Putin will use this nuclear weapon after what never happened before? I think, he tried to push leaders, he tried to push ordinary people and make them feel frightening to say this because his own situation is not perfect. Russian economy was not prepared for this long war. They might do this for a few months, maybe for 1 year. But even they try to change economy to military type, again, it doesn't work properly. Why they always need a new people or soldiers from, now we know, from North Korea, some of them from Africa, because they don't have enough people in a front line first, and they don't have enough people working in the factories. And this is a real situation of Russia. And for Putin, it's better maybe to stop this war, but in a position what suits him. He doesn't want to give up territory what he already occupied. He even wants to take a bigger part, and he needs to present to all Russian people inside of Russia it's his victory. And to make this, he needs to stop UK, United States, France to supply Ukraine with these weapons.
So is that how you see things heading to from here? Do you think a negotiated settlement is the most likely way forward for Ukraine? And I also want to ask you what you think the advent of Donald Trump on the scene would mean for such a negotiated settlement.
Again, I would be the last person who will try to predict what Donald Trump will do, because it's, of course, his decision might be last, but it's every time depending to his advisors. And we need to see who's around him and what kind of advice he might receive. And he obviously less politician, but more businessman. And he will calculate what's a way would be more profited for him. And this is all my answers for now. We don't know what situation might be preferent for Donald Trump.
You've said that President Putin wants to sow fear and disunity amongst Ukraine's allies. How much success do you think he's having in this regard?
Again, from very beginning, it was not real allies. It was not real consolidation of countries against this war. And this is what was not happened. This was supposed to be finished just in a few months after this all consolidation. This is always calculation. How long Ukraine will survive, or Putin will use nuclear weapon or not. And this is always delayed. But this is exactly what Putin wanted. It's his always strategy to make people or countries to be against each other, not doing work together. And now, actually, we have another very serious situation. We can call this like a proxy war. And he used some, of course, not Putin personal, but the system tried to use a different type of destabilization in the different countries. No, for example, today morning we have an aircraft in Lithuania, in the Baltic countries, collapse. This was business jet, DHL. But you know, a similar situation happened in UK, but not with a jet, but with some office, when again DHL was under, I would say, attack, because parcel was just exploded. And we still don't know what happened with this jet, with DHL in Vilnius. And this is all strategy, what Putin's system tried to use against civilization, to feel people insecure, unsafe. And what I say, consolidation and union of this country against Putin as evil. I don't have another word about him, how he all doing now against all world, just to stop.
Yeah, and of course we've had the head of MI5 in the United Kingdom, the domestic intelligence agency, saying that Putin's henchmen, he says, want to cause chaos on the streets of the UK and of Europe. I mean, do you think that's something that can and will really happen?
No, it did happen, and we have some already result and hackers attack and some Russian hackers behind of this. What I said happened to DHL, and even hooligans. They might be locals, but they would be used by this Russian security service to destabilize this situation. Even provocative involvement to different meetings of protest. Again, this might be some trace of Russian security service. And this is, again, we're allowed to do this. It's like an illness. If you don't have a very strong treatment, immediate, maybe very, again, what I say, strong, illness will not finish. Everything what we're doing, we just a small portion, but not enough to treat this illness. Because Putin is a real illness. Because what I see now, it's like a metastase. If you don't treat cancer properly, you have a metastase in your whole body. And what he tried to do now.
What is the state of the opposition in Russia today? Because, of course, Alexei Navalny died earlier this year. Is there anything left of the opposition?
Alexei Navalny was definitely the most prominent and powerful oppositioner, but not alone. He was just the most, what I said, well-known. But opposition in Russia was destroyed many years ago. And we never, since beginning Putin in the power, we didn't have a proper opposition presenting in a parliament. This opposition might make any change. We can call this system opposition. Any other opposition was not system. They could go for protest in the streets. They might try to be elected to the local, to council or some parliaments of towns or cities, but not a bigger result opposition could achieve being in Russia. And particularly after war started in 2014, I would like to mention, with the Crimea invasion and all this activity in the east of Ukraine, Putin started to squeeze opposition more and more. And any change to do in Russia was not possible. Some people escaped, some people been arrested, some people been killed, as Alexei Navalny. This is what we all say about opposition. And now I believe any person who against the war, who disagree with what Putin is doing, is opposition. And if you still be a normal and not supporting this war, you might be this power. And now it looks like to be Russian and save your normality. It means opposition now.
The only other person in the world who probably understands the situation that you've been through, the pain you've been through, the only other parallel I can think of is Yulia Navalnaya, the widow of Alexei Navalny. And I'm just wondering whether you've maintained contact with her and whether you see her having a role going forward and really carrying on the work of her husband.
this is a lot of similarity and difference. Of course, I feel so sorry for Yulia Navalny, who was very supportive to her husband, but I don't think she ever expected to be a leader of opposition. I still don't know if it's her choice or she could not say no to all supporters of Alexei Navalny. But it means she's very brave, because it's not so long since Alexei Navalny died, and her decision was almost immediate to start this new position. And again, for what I could say, it's just I wish her success, and if she would be able to consolidate people around her. But again, I don't think we all need to find any leader. You have to keep these all right things inside of you and doing even little things, but what might change something in the future. But for young people, maybe it's very important to consolidate around somebody. If there's any activities, as for example was a march of peace in Berlin and on 17th of November, again, is good. If people might find somebody who is a similar or believes to similar things, it's okay, it's good, it's right.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but I really want to thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us, Marina Litvinenko. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Well, the war has cost Lebanon an estimated $8.5 billion in physical and economic damage. That's according to one estimate from the World Bank. Well, to talk to us more about this is Lebanon's Economy and Trade Minister, Amin Salam. Thank you so much for joining us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Reports that we've received suggest there have been some celebrations in Beirut. Hezbollah supporters portraying the truce as being a victory for them. Is that how it feels for people in Lebanon right now? Does this feel like a victory?
Hello, and thanks for having me with you guys. Well, let me tell you, it's a very happy day for Lebanon. It's a very important and critical day for Lebanon. I wouldn't put it in the context of victory. I wouldn't put it in the context of celebration. Yes, the Hezbollah base have been driving back to their homes, to the south, driving back to their cities to check on how things are. To them, it's a joyful moment that they're going back to their villages, their houses, their areas to see what's happening, because they have been displaced in very dire conditions for a long time. But I can tell you from a political perspective, it's not yet a time to celebrate. It's not yet a time to declare victory. It's a time to really monitor and hope that this ceasefire will accomplish its full targets and will pass those 60 difficult days, leading to a longer standing stability and peace for Lebanon and for the region. This is really how we are looking at it. This is how I'm reading it from my position, especially as Minister of Economy, which is the biggest struggle in this country today.
Does it feel like a fragile ceasefire when you look at it? I mean, let's not forget the bombardment of some areas of Beirut only ended less than 24 hours ago. So I know this is a difficult question to answer, but I mean, do you see it holding?
It is a very fragile ceasefire. I mean, you could feel even to the last minute or to the last few hours before the ceasefire, Lebanon was being bombed very aggressively. I can tell you from my location where I am now, yesterday I was in my office, bombs were all over this area. I mean, we could see them, we could feel them, we could hear them, ambulances all over the streets, still massive casualties. So this ceasefire is very, very fragile. That's why I'm using the term we should monitor carefully the next 60 days, because any escalation, any mistake any bad intention from any side can lead to the complete destruction of all the good work, all the diplomatic work that has been done to lead to this ceasefire.
Some people will be wondering, and it must have felt like a very long few weeks of Israeli bombardment, but what took so long? Why couldn't this deal have been secured sooner?
Well, I can tell you, this deal is over 3 weeks old. I mean, the basic elements of this deal were already in place. The biggest problem with this deal was that the Israeli side, first of all, asked to put France outside the equation. That was a big blow to Lebanon, and that was a big blow to the deal. But the more important one was the one that related to the sovereignty and decision of the Lebanese people, including Hezbollah as well, for Israel to feel that they can intervene and they can assess any non-compliance of the 1701, where they can intervene immediately through the sky or through the land and break the ceasefire when they see appropriate, without having the U.S. or any other country being involved. That was a major pending element of the deal that dragged it another 2 weeks until the United States stepped in and said, I will be the one that will bear this responsibility. I will assess if there was a non-compliance or if there was a violation of 1701 or of this agreement particularly, and then we will assess what needs to be done. Now, this has been kind of camouflaged in a certain political diplomatic way within the deal, but the U.S. managed to help us get over that article and then get the approval from the Lebanese side, followed by the approval from the Israeli side.
Okay, so Israeli forces, we understand, are going to start leaving the border area in the south during the course of the next 60 days. And I'm wondering why people think that UNIFIL and the Lebanese army are going to be able to secure that border area when they've failed to do so since the year 2006. What's going to be different this time?
What is different this time is a very simple new reality that has come to play. And that is the fact that today there is an approach, a regional approach going under a Middle East agreement, if we want to call it, especially with the new U.S. administration coming into the White House, that will follow the Saudi pledge for a zero conflict region. So under a zero conflict region approach, it is expected that a country like Lebanon that has a major conflict with Israel will be one of the countries that will follow the lead of a zero conflict approach for a longer standing peace in the region. Having said that, that means today, after all what happened, Hezbollah will be working closer with the Lebanese government on solutions in Lebanon and not on escalations in Lebanon, whether it's related directly to their role as a resilience group, especially that this role will be over once there is a peace process after the ceasefire with Israel, or after there is an understanding for a long-standing peace. How that will shape up, we're still politically not there. But I think this is the only thing that changed that will give the international community today a strong reason to support the Lebanese army, contrary to what we had in the past. In the past, the Lebanese army was politically dragged into becoming weak because that was the direction in the region. That was how things were done. Today, there's a big push for the Lebanese army to be supported by the international community, to be funded by the international community, to govern and have sovereignty all over the Lebanese territory. And we see that happening. This will be the only path where Lebanon will join the zero conflict process and will witness a long-standing peace in the region.
Minister, one of your colleagues who has been extremely busy the last few weeks is, of course, the Parliament Speaker, Nabil Berri, and he has been urging the swift election of a new president of Lebanon. He says this is of the utmost importance. I think everyone agrees on that. It's been talked about for months. Do you think it can now happen?
Well, you know, we were hoping that when all this conflict started, we should seize the opportunity to be unified, all of us Lebanese people, Lebanese parties, to really elect the president. Because everybody knows that one of the major hurdles of electing a president is internal in Lebanon. And now, what we have been through the past year, and particularly the past few months, have brought Lebanese people closer together. We have felt more unity than ever before amongst the different political parties. And I think the Speaker of the House is one of the top politicians that read opportunities and seize opportunities. And today he is a key player in the ceasefire. He sees that there is a serious opportunity now to take advantage of the positive momentum amongst the political parties to bring them back to the parliament and to elect the president, because he knows and we know that the next stage which will require a head of state and a fully fledged government to negotiate and have a seat on the table in the region for the future of the Middle East, the future of Lebanon, the role of Lebanon in the Middle East. Without a head of a state, without a proper government in place, we will always be a weak link and we will not get our best share of the deal.
Indeed, and having a fully functioning government does not mean, does it, the end of Lebanon's problems? Because for 5 years now, the country's been in financial, economic turmoil. Millions of Lebanese people are living a very difficult existence, plunged into poverty. How is the country going to rebuild? Because this is where you come into play.
Well, I mean, as you know, we've shared a lot of details, I think, in our last get-together on TV, in our last interview about the economy, the billions of dollars, the losses. I think, to answer your question in a very clear way, the only path forward is having a full government in place, reflecting confidence to the international community, particularly regaining very fast the trust of the international community by complying with all the international agreements, including 1701, the Lebanese army moving forward with its presence on the entire territory. But most importantly for the economy, I would say, and for rebuilding Lebanon, and we all know that without the international community, we will not be able to do that. We will need to very, very, very quickly go with the reforms that we have been dragging our feet on for the past few years. We should move forward with the reforms immediately. We should portray and reflect trust to the international community, particularly to the Arab world. Otherwise, it will be difficult to ask anyone for help. It will be difficult to expect that money will be poured on Lebanon to rebuild what has been destroyed and to join the future of economic growth and prosperity in the Middle East. Without doing those, Lebanon will not join that path. And we are hoping we will be able to join that path.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Amin Salam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we're going to turn our attention to the United Kingdom, a country that has had 9 prime ministers in the past 30 years, 5 of them in the last 8 years, and 3 of them in the last 2 years and 2 months. Well, let's get a quick reminder of who the British premiers were. Well, as we just saw there, Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, has been in office since July of this year. He was preceded by Rishi Sunak, who was in office for 19 months. Sunak was preceded by Liz Truss, who was in office for just 49 days. And today we're going to be talking about a number of these British leaders, but with a particular focus on Liz Truss. Well, we're joined now by the British historian and educator, Sir Anthony Selden. Sir Anthony, thank you for joining us. You've written biographies of all the British Prime Ministers going back to John Major, the most recent of which was published a couple of months ago and is about the shortest serving British Prime Minister in history, which is, of course, Liz Truss, who was in office for 49 days. The title of that best-selling book, which you can see on your screens there, is Truss at number 10, How Not to Be Prime Minister. The title in itself is somewhat revealing. Thank you again for joining us, Sir Anthony. I mean, 384 pages about someone who served for 49 days. To be fair, that's about half the number of pages you wrote for your Boris Johnson biography. But tell us a little bit about how you wrote so much about Truss, someone who had such a short tenure.
Well, Tom, very nice to be on your excellent programme. And the book is really an exploration of why it matters. Political leadership matters in democracies, and how to be Prime Minister, and why so many have not performed anywhere near as effectively as they should. The last really effective British Prime Minister was Margaret Thatcher, and she fell almost 35 years ago. I mean, that's a third of a century. And I think in my experience of a lifetime, really, of writing about Prime Ministers, there are 10 rules that Prime Ministers need to follow if they are to be successful. And spectacularly and unswervingly, Liz Truss broke every single one of those 10 rules. And that explains why she had the incredible achievement, if that is what it is, of being Britain's shortest ever surviving Prime Minister in over 300 years.
Yes, and you make the point in your book quite early on that 49 days doesn't sound quite so bad when you compare it to some of the, for example, Spanish prime ministers of the last couple of hundred years, 9 of whom who've had stints of less than 10 days, you point out. But you do also say early in the book that from the get-go, the response to Truss was tepid, you said. We all noticed it didn't feel right. I'm just wondering where you think it all went so wrong for her.
Well, the general election victory that's so important to a British Prime Minister, as it has been to Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister at the moment, it's very important they win their own general election victory, because that gives them a confidence and a mandate and a legitimacy. And the general election victory was won in December 2019, not by her, but by Boris Johnson. And so when she succeeded Johnson, many in the party were very angry because they still wanted Johnson to be the leader. And she didn't have broad support from the Conservative MPs in the House of Commons. So what she should have done, and what really any sensible leader would have done, would have been to reach out and win those people over. But instead, she just took no time to try to befriend them and to bring them on side. She just went ahead with her agenda and somehow assumed that she had her own general election mandate and entitlement to embark the country on the boldest economic reform programme since Margaret Thatcher. Now, Margaret Thatcher spent 2 and more years before she started bringing her own policies into play. Liz Truss spent barely 2 days before she started unleashing her own. So that sense of timing is very important for political leaders, and she didn't have it, and she didn't have the political nous to know that you have to keep your MPs on side, because lose them and you are gone.
Yeah, we're going to come back to talk about Liz Truss in just a moment, but I just want to pick up on what you said about it not feeling right for Liz Truss right at the get-go, and also what you were saying about her not winning her own election. Because, of course, Sir Keir Starmer, the current Prime Minister, and I imagine you're taking notes for one of your future biographies, I'm wondering whether it feels right with him, in your opinion.
So this is very interesting because the British general election in July of this year, the Labour Prime Minister Keir Starmer did very, very well in terms of the numbers of MPs. I mean, a dazzling majority in the House of Commons, but he didn't do at all well on the votes in the country. So barely a third of people voted for him. So he has to be very careful, not of his own MPs in the House of Commons, as Liz Truss needed to be careful, but he needs to be very careful to make certain he doesn't alienate people in the country, because he doesn't have that broad support that even Tony Blair had, particularly in 1997 and 2001 when he won his own landslide election victories. So they have different reasons for being cautious and careful.
Going back to Liz Truss, you say, quote, she came from nowhere to being a serious contender in the leadership race in the space of a matter of days or weeks. You also say there were some in the party who saw her as, quote, fundamentally silly. And I'm just wondering how someone who people in the party regard as being fundamentally silly ever make it to frontline politics in the first place.
Well, I think it's not dissimilar to Boris Johnson, and people knew, the Conservative MPs knew that he would be a risk and a liability, voting him in to be the party leader and Prime Minister after Theresa May, that they knew that he wasn't, didn't work very hard, couldn't be very consistent, wasn't very good with administration, but they thought it was a risk that was worth taking, partly because there simply weren't the strong Conservative candidates with the ability, with the popular appeal. And it was a different kind of risk. And of course, it worked with Boris Johnson because he succeeded Theresa May in the summer of 2019 and went on to win his landslide, as we said, in December 2019. So that gamble paid off, at least for a while, because he was an election winner, but then he was no good at being Prime Minister, and he lost the confidence because he wasn't decisive. He didn't steer the country in any clear direction. He couldn't deal with crises well. And it was a different kind of gamble with Liz Truss. She does have popular appeal. She had a very clear Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan style agenda. It seemed to make a lot of sense with the country having such sluggish growth, but the party knew that it would be a risk. With her, it was that she can lack judgment, that she can be very impulsive. I think that's what's meant by when you say the word silly, I think that's what they are thinking of, that she didn't have that kind of ability to hold back and to weigh up all the options before leaping in. And, again, as with Boris Johnson, that proved to be a mistake. And not everyone would agree with that. But with Liz Truss, I think everyone would agree, apart from herself and one or two supporters, that it was a mistake to put her in because she blew up the country. And she went for a very impulsive budget. She didn't check that she was doing everything properly. And the country suffered, and it was a big factor in the Conservatives losing the July 2024 general election, and it's been a big source of damage to the country, its credibility abroad, and it makes it look like Italy with this constant transition of prime ministers. Britain had 5 prime ministers in 9 years. Now, that hasn't happened before. Very, very unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder whether you perhaps would attribute blame to what happened before Theresa May took office a bit more. I should point out that you did say in one of your other interviews that you feel that Boris Johnson cheapened the United Kingdom. I just wonder what exactly you meant by that.
So Boris Johnson had many of the qualities that you need to be a good leader. He had optimism. He is a splendid communicator. He has a big vision, but he couldn't be serious. Ultimately, he found it very hard to be serious about anything at all, and it's a job in particular of a Conservative Prime Minister. I mean, Conservative means that you conserve the state, preserve it, honour it. But he didn't do that, and he humiliated the monarchy, the late Queen Elizabeth, which made her very angry in the prorogation of Parliament. She thought that was intrusive. He belittled the civil service, particularly the Treasury. He attacked them. He attacked the judiciary. And one by one, he attacked many of the institutions that make up the British state, and in his own behaviour, his personal conduct, his inability to give that kind of example to other people inside and outside politics of what it means to be a hard worker, to show integrity, to show sacrifice, to show judgment, to have principles, to be honest. All of these were called into question, and trust in British government that was running low anyway declined significantly under him. So that was the sad story, and even his supporters who were desperate for him to become Prime Minister, by the end almost all of them had felt that he simply wasn't capable of doing it. It's like having somebody as captain of a football team who might have some of the qualities of being a captain, of being able to communicate and enthuse everybody, but they're no good at football. He was no good at politics, or government in particular.
Yeah, and I think this is an extension of what you're saying, but you've said that recent British leaders have tended to be all about trashing without reforming. I mean, you're talking about trashing institutions, trashing things, but without offering any suitable replacement. I mean, do you think American politics is perhaps having an overarching influence on British politics and the style of it?
Maybe. I mean, the whole notion formed in part by digital technology that we have to destroy, we have to be disruptive, we have to fundamentally reorganize and replace. And look, there's a lot of truth in that. If we look at the British state, if we look at the judiciary, the police, the health service, the civil service, the military, indeed, we can see that there are lots of areas where improvements need to come in, but just to denigrate them without improving them, well, that's not what leaders do. Leaders should be supporting while also transforming, whereas he was destructive without making any of those institutions better at all, or indeed the great prime ministers like Margaret Thatcher, the Labour leader Clement Attlee, Winston Churchill, they left the state and they left the country and the union stronger than when they inherited office. So now Donald Trump, who knows what he's going to do. He didn't leave the institutions of American government stronger when he ceased to be the president in January 2021. Let's see what he does this time round. He's making very threatening noises about the FBI and the CIA and the whole quality of government, and he's bringing in reformers to slash the size of government, and I'm sure that needs to happen. The question is, can he retain the best people can he retain the morale of the institutions that make up the American state? Any country on earth of the 220 are dependent, every single one, of all different kinds of political system. They all depend upon officials to run the engine of the state. And if you denigrate and collapse morale, then you don't get a high-quality, high-performing public service. And that's what we'll see. Maybe Donald Trump will pull it off. Who knows?
The turnover of British prime ministers has been high, as you pointed out, and I'm assuming that as the nation's biographer of prime ministers in chief, that's kept you very busy and meant you've had some pretty tight deadlines turning books around. You're sort of 2 biographies behind at the moment because the Truss book has only just come out. Then, of course, I'm assuming you're working on your Rishi Sunak one. Then there'll be the Keir Starmer one. Do you ever anticipate writing a biography about Nigel Farage?
Well, if that means will Nigel Farage become Prime Minister? Well, if he was to become Prime Minister, I would certainly write on him. But I wouldn't write on him. So Nigel Farage is unlike, I think, any leader in British political history. So we've had the Prime Minister since 1721. Going on 304 years come next April. There's never been somebody who's come in from an insurgent populist party and made such an impression. So now we can see part of that heritage in Trump himself and in Emmanuel Macron. But who knows? I think it's unlikely that he will become Prime Minister. But one thing we know is that there is extraordinary, supreme volatility at the moment in elections, both for sitting governments and for challenger governments. It's very hard to predict. There's a lot of disillusion with the lack of economic growth in Europe, and where people are cross, angry by their poor economic prospects, they do tend to turn to extremes of both the left and the right. So there is Nigel Farage sitting very prettily on the right. It is not at all impossible, even if I think unlikely, that he will become Prime Minister. But who knows?
Yeah, I mean, of course, for the benefit of our viewers, Nigel Farage heads up the Reform right-wing political party. And do you think it's fair to say that perhaps the common denominator for a lot of the chaos that we've seen in British politics these last 8 years coincides quite neatly, in fact, with the Brexit referendum?
So the Brexit referendum that took place in mid-2016, I think, was both a cause but also a consequence of a deep malaise in the country, in Britain, which also exists in particular in Europe. But you can see echoes of it in South Korea, for example. So in Europe, where you have Europe used to be the powerhouse of the world in the 19th century and for the first part of the 20th century. But since, in particular, the late 20th century and in particular the global financial crisis of 2007 and 8, growth has been sluggish in Europe, in particular in contrast, well, obviously to China, but in contrast to the United States. And that in part explained Brexit. The belief was that Europe is very overly bureaucratized, too much red tape, too many restrictions for entrepreneurs, creativity, business flourishing. And it was a desire to get sovereignty back away out of the EU and back into Britain. And of course, the fact that it hasn't worked out, there hasn't been growth since. And even the big claim of getting more money into the NHS hasn't happened, and getting immigration down hasn't happened. So it appears that those who voted for Brexit were lied to, that further stokes up unrest, and the belief is, it wasn't Brexit that was wrong, but it's that Brexit hasn't been implemented properly, and the people in charge of the Conservatives, in charge of the government since Brexit, haven't been, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss included, Rishi Sunak included, didn't pursue the Brexit ideal. Now, Nigel Farage promises to do a proper Brexit and no doubt have a trade relationship with the US, and so it's an attractive promise, even if it's unachievable.
Just lastly, and briefly, because I'm sure you have to move on, but there have been, as we've been saying, 9 prime ministers of the UK in the last 30 years. I just want to ask you, in very simple terms, who was the best and who was the worst of them?
So that is an extraordinary number, 9 in 30 years. I think the worst, that's easy. I mean, the worst was Boris Johnson in terms of discrediting the country and making promises that he didn't fulfill. I mean, he made Brexit happen as the head of the Brexit campaigning organisation, but he didn't yield the benefits from Brexit. Liz Truss also very poor, so I put them at the worst. And amongst the best, I would include certainly winning elections, Tony Blair, but I think he let himself down over the Iraq War, and that is a stain on his premiership. So who else would there be? David Cameron did some good things, but Libya wasn't a success. I think that John Major, who succeeded Margaret Thatcher, very much denigrated at the time, but with hindsight, he looks like a very successful hands-on Prime Minister. But Gordon Brown also steered Britain